I started recording. All right, guys, I put finale on this. I just want to kind of wrap up this series and start fresh. I think in this series, I got caught between a few priorities. Each of the webinars I think has been very profitable. Some I particularly was happy about. Some I felt like maybe were a little bit meandering, but those are very helpful in their own way. They just sometimes, anyway, just depends on individual people. A lot of people like those very much too. But of course, they can be difficult sometimes to pay attention to. Let's see here. Okay. Hey, Peter. All right. So we're going to wrap things up with this particular series today, and then I think I can put together a series. I may or may not do some kind of one-offs for a little while I'm preparing, and I'd like to kind of have a pretty good overall organizing principle and structure for a series that can be good for people in general, kind of wherever they're coming from. I think my priority with this series was weirdly enough, people that are already kind of into law of implication, have a background in it. I want you guys who kind of want to master this and take it to others and so forth, or integrate it with what you're doing, to not get it wrong, like at the core, right? To not feel like you're using LOI principles and then be doing that to some degree, but lack a certain foundation, or when push comes to shove, not really having it fully right with checking your own ideas and so forth. I don't mean being right about everything. We're not going to necessarily reach that part, right? Like, but there's still I want us to, you know, there's different aspects of the foundation. One is a basic humility, which I think a lot or even all of people that are really serious about law of implication will have, where even if they have things wrong, they'll want to get things right. So that's huge, right? That's excellent. And then when it comes to like applying methods, anyway, but like just to be able, I don't, it's one of the kind of mysteries to me is I don't know how, like where my talent ends and where method begins, to, in a certain sense of like, how much of what I do, how much of what I might call law of implication is something that I do particularly well and easily. There's going to be other people that are going to have a significant talent for it. It may exceed mine, maybe less than mine, but they still might be very talented versus you know, the general population. And then on the other hand, there's methods that are you know, correct or not. A little bit like calculus, right? Some people might have a real talent for that type of thinking. There's a basic method of calculus that's true for all people, right? Depending on how kind of easily or how difficult it might be for someone to kind of to get to work with calculus. There's certain rules that are true, but then the question is, if someone's particularly good at it or even invented it, then how much are they going to duplicate that, and how much does it matter, you know, to certain people? Now, with law of implication as opposed to calculus, we all need it, right? So there's a certain amount of basic competency that everybody needs, because it's not like my opinion or my take on things. It's a discovery of correct thinking methods and more, right? Frames, assumptions that are, there's a whole bunch, some more on the surface, some more deep, of assumptions, right? That some are kind of universal for pretty much all people based on the way minds work and brains process. Some are cultural, but nearly all cultures have them to some degree, right? And of course, there's plenty of differences between cultures, obviously, with more kind of surface assumptions. But anyway, I think I can do a series where I'm particularly focused, kind of like I was early on, and like when I first introduced things, and then during alchemy, where I think both of those attempts, kind of in 2013, and then in alchemy around 2016, where I did 30 webinars that were each actually quite long, in the 3-hour range. With this new series this year, I don't plan to do it in the 3-hour range, but maybe I'll be able to have a format where it's like an hour of me talking, an hour of discussion. I'm not sure about that exactly, but I think I can do a reasonably good job of having a bit of a progression and structure while still hitting the important points. And then as the series progresses, continuing to make sure, like I care about a lot too, that there's not, that it has some sort of defense against getting tainted in people's minds, where they're not veering off in an importantly wrong direction and then thinking that they're not, you know. All right. Now, last webinar, I introduced an idea that in one sense is familiar, or is leads us to a similar place as things I've talked to all along in law of implication, but in another sense had a bit of a new way of explaining it, or a new way of presenting it. And it had to do with really the core of law of implication, right? There's a few angles on the core. This angle was, and I'll actually mention a couple angles in the core right now, but the one from last webinar was, I phrased it during the webinar as we go to achieve whatever, right, which is what we're doing all the time, is we whether we have some degree of awareness of that we're going kind of after a goal or a feeling of progress kind of constantly, right? It's kind of the natural consequence of the state of existence that we're in, right? We want to make things better. The alternative would be to either just be perfectly comfortable staring at the wall doing nothing, right? But that's kind of agitating for people, right? So there's a sense of wanting to make progress of some sort, which has to relate to which implies that there's some goal going on of some sort in our minds, either some goal or some set of goals or something goal-like, right? That we're kind of constantly trying to pursue, one or multiple, and you know, and so forth. And another alternative would be if we were like consciously trying to make things worse, which it's not only illogical, but even though it might seem like people try to do that, they're really not, right? Like on a certain level, everything's kind of geared one way or the other, kind of necessarily, no matter who somebody is, no matter how good or bad their thinking might be, and so forth, they're at least attempting, or their mind is to make things better, right? There could be a ton of errors, wrong assumptions about that, where they end up making things worse, but they're still trying to make things better, whether, you know, even if that's being done with a whole bunch of contradictions that don't end up actually making that happen. So as we go about doing that, as we go about pursuing our goals, basically living our lives, trying to make things better one way or the other, then by default, what people want to do is to see the result, right? Or the set of results relative to the goals that their mind is working on at the time. And the paradigm shift, and then absent of seeing the result, they want to see progress or see a path to progress or something. They basically want to see better in the sense of they want to see what they're trying to see. But I brought up the idea of we want to make a paradigm shift to trying to see better in a different sense of if we're looking at a landscape or looking outside and we want it outside to look nicer, and we think about how we might change what's outside and get a landscaper or do this or that. But if we're looking through a dirty window but without realizing it, then there might be little symptoms or anomalies or something that cause us at some point to like think, maybe there's something I'm not realizing, right? Because if you don't see a dirty, that you're looking through a dirty window, it's kind of complicated. If you see that you're looking through a dirty window, right? Like there's the kind of little, I don't know what the right word is, anecdote is not quite the right word, but in self-improvement, you might come across some version of, you know, a guy is like trying to cut down a tree. with a saw or a bunch of trees, right? And he's sawing on a tree, and a guy walks up to him and he's like, "Your saw is dull. Maybe you should sharpen your saw." And then the guy who's sawing is like, "Well, I don't have time to sharpen my saw. I need to cut down these trees," right? So that exists, that idea, and I'll kind of take a look at what category that type of thing goes into. That's a very relevant type of understanding when it comes to achievement, of course, is to be aware of and when to sharpen your saw. But in that case, the saw is visible and you at least see that you're using the saw, right? So what we might not see, whoops, let's see what we got here. That's the top of a while ago. Here. So I could have put the word like frames or assumptions up here. Let's see if I can still do that. It might not be easy to click and do that. All right. So it isn't. With the saw, it's like a frame or an assumption or tool that is, in that case, it would be a visible saw. We'd be aware, we could see the saw, right? We're using it. And it's external. We don't really identify with it. If someone says that your saw is dull and you're sawing something, typically someone won't take that personally, so to speak. They might if they themselves built the saw, or for whatever reason, if they really just didn't want to question that at the time, they might take it personally. But it's also very plausible that they wouldn't, right? Because it may or may not be looked at as part of their kind of core identity or their saw or something they do that they identify with. Again, if they do identify it in some way, if it somehow gets associated as part of their identity, then they'll feel kind of defensive and like they're being attacked if you mention the saw. But in the case of a saw, it might also be that they don't feel attacked, right? And that's how people are, right? Is we have stuff we identify with, and it could be core beliefs, it could be other various assumptions, it could be something we created, it could be our career, it could be our body, right? And it just varies from moment to moment and based on circumstances, but one way or the other, and from person to person and so forth, right? But that's kind of the dividing line of whether someone's particularly going to be defensive or not, with feeling like they're being attacked if we're talking about improving something, right? Has to do with if they identify. So when I say external or internal, it could be like identified with or not identified with, could be another term. So with a saw, it's visible. With the dirty window illustration, I mean it to not be visible, right? Like, of course, you could be looking through a dirty window and see that you are. But if we just make it in our little mental image that someone's not aware that they're looking through a dirty window, then, but they are, right? Then if they were able to figure that out and clean the window, then if we think about what would happen at that point, it's kind of interesting. Without any more effort, the landscape outside would look differently, and they wouldn't have to look at the landscape any differently except for the fact that they cleaned their dirty window. And furthermore, they might see ways to improve the landscape at that point, right? And we could improve the metaphor, and instead of there just being like a landscape outside, like they're at a, like an English manor and they're looking at a window to a landscape that they're thinking of improving, there could be some, project related to their career or making money or, or whatever, right? That you kind of adjust the metaphor where you're looking through something that's not very clear, and then you're not seeing something about what you're that you need to do or whatever. Once you clean the window, then you're going to kind of seem smarter relative to adjusting what you're looking at through the window, right? But all you did was clean the window, and all of a sudden, again, you don't need without yet adding any more self-improvement techniques or determination or smarts or cleverness or whatever, just various things become apparent. But the trick becomes when the window itself is invisible. And then the trick becomes even further more tricky when there's a whole nother layer, which in practice is very impactful, which is when someone identifies that window, that dirty window, as part of themselves in a way that they don't want to believe that, and then you can add yet another layer where our original experience of the world, what I talked about in alchemy in the beginning, is in a sense being helpless, right? You're a baby, and there's basic things that you're kind of programmed to want, and you can't do much about getting them, right? You could basically scream and hope, right? And then you grow up a little bit and you're exploring the world, but you're not only kind of helpless, and you have some amount of ability, like the fact that you can cry, right? And then that might then you might get help when you cry. So then you can feel like, oh, I can do stuff, right? And then as you grow up a little bit, you move your hands, you can gather things, you can do things, you can impact the environment, you can do things to try to get what you want. And you can also gain knowledge, right? But both your knowledge and your power is limited. And so it's really, what that means is it's outside of your control, whether you can really experience a lot of pain, a lot of lack, a lot of suffering, right? And also, just to move forward, there's a certain amount of kind of confidence that you want to have in your actions and thoughts, right, and so forth. And so people's minds create this whole defense against, like there's kind of a benefit to feeling confident and competent. And there's this kind of shortcut or short circuit kind of thing that's done, where it becomes important to feel sure that both you're right, your mind is right about its conclusions and what it's telling you. Well, you don't even think of it as your mind telling you something, you just think of it, I thought of it, right? Also, as the way the mind works is it develops confidence in its own construct of the world, right? Its own knowledge and stuff, as it develops conclusions about how the world works, and then tests those conclusions just sort of mechanically, right? Like as you look around and you walk and you grab things, you put things in your mouth and so forth as you're young. Then it develops confidence, and it makes that confidence kind of ends up as a feeling, right? That you're aware of, like, yeah, I'm sure of this, right? And so as it develops and people grow up a bit, they reach a point where it becomes important to there's an identity, right? That is tied into what we call ego and so forth, but there's an identity that involves not only just core beliefs, but even that you're your body, and if you're things you create, things that you pursue, your ability at gymnastics, your ability at school, and then later a career, right? All that sort of stuff can be part of an identity, and it can feel important for incorrect but kind of real reasons, where you need to believe that either you're awesome or at least you're not too unawesome, right? And that can sort of give you confidence and so on and so forth. Instead, I've talked about the alternative is that you can get confidence through method, right? But that takes a lot of layers of figuring out. But as you figure that out and make the paradigm shift to that, it's very transformative in so many ways. And now you're getting confidence from not only a correct place, but a place that can then be corrected. Because a method can be worked on, right? Your identity can become that you're developing and working on and improving and fixing and filtering wrong ideas out of a method and a tree of constructed, well-constructed knowledge of things, or frames, a set of frames that are stacked. So everything I'm saying now has to do with this idea of an identity that has different aspects, right? Body, could be career, could be other things that you've worked on, and then core beliefs and such. These things are in many cases invisible, and I have examples lined up here on the next slides for you. But it's these, not only invisible, but internal is like the identity. And then if we're not aware of them, then it turns out there's a huge opportunity there to vastly improve your life, your functional brilliance. You one example is that so when you think, you're basically using some combination, just to be a little bit simple, but a little bit descriptive here. When you're thinking about things, then you're using kind of like mental objects and words, right? I don't have to get too deep into what each of those means, but you're basically having, there's objects in your mind, so to speak, that you're thinking about, right? If you're thinking about building a website, right, then there's mental objects that you're thinking about, right? Like a website, various programs, a keyboard, right? Having a laptop, right? Those are, when you're thinking about those, that's what I mean by a mental object. And then, of course, relationships between those objects, and we use words in conjunction with mental images, and so we're thinking about things, right? And of course, our mind uses a process of association. But anyway, when you're thinking, you're using words and mental objects. Our mental objects that we're thinking about are pulled from our basic idea of reality and what it's made of. And our words are pulled from our idea of how to define words, plus our sense of reality and what it's made of, where the mental objects come from. Because the words are referring to these mental objects, and which we also might think of as real external objects, and relationships between those objects and so forth. When people try to start to think about deep stuff, the problems in their view of reality and how that relates to mental objects, and how words are defined and what words refer to, the major errors or basic way that what the mind does as you grow up is it makes a sort of mental construct of reality. Like it can be called in different ways of speaking, like a map of the world, or like a mental map of the world, or I've called it a reality construct in the past. I can call it a story construct. You're making like a story about the world that you don't really see exactly as a story. Normally people just think of it as reality, right? But in neurolinguistic programming, they had this sort of breakthrough about someone's mental map of the world is different than the world itself, which when you understand what that's referring to, it's sort of so obvious that you almost think like, well, did I get the concept right? But in practice, it's not obvious to people. I've used the term naive realism. Normally, the way people operate in the moment, day to day, is just based on naive realism, right? Is that our thoughts about the world are basically correct, and unless if our thought is not correct, we don't. It's kind of the plot of the moment. If maybe something isn't correct, we don't and almost can't question. There's so much framework and assumptions that goes into every moment that we live our lives that it would be impossible to question all those things every second. We couldn't really function. So we kind of adopt this, what you see is what you get, or my mental construct of reality, or my brain's construct or story about reality is reality, and that's how we function. There's nothing wrong with functioning that way, except that wherever our story about reality doesn't overlap accurately with reality, then we have a chance of running into a problem, right? Like it's kind of out of our control, right? It's not that different than if you have a blurry window that you're looking out of, or blurry glasses or vision, then there's just a chance that that's going to be a problem, right? If there's a blind spot when you're driving, then if you don't compensate or deal with that in some way, then once in a while that might just be a problem. It might even kill you, right? Like, so it's it's just kind of unpredictable how big the consequence is going to be, but sometimes it can be large, right? Some of those large consequences are tough in a sense because they're kind of like in reality right now, there's issues and there's cultural ideas that are out there that are also tied to political ideas and so forth. When I say political, it just literally means like when we're okay and even support the use of violence towards other people, right? That kind of at an aggregate level, it's just kind of one of my puzzles. On an aggregate level, that's extremely impactful. Like the lack of overlap between people's story and reality, and like between their story and correct ideas, is significant in various ways that are very impactful. Cause a tremendous amount of suffering, but also kind of psyche destruction. What I mean by psyche destruction is like, imagine you raise a child in an environment where their peers are like torturing puppies, right? And it's like normal to torture puppies. And then, and I apologize if even saying that is kind of difficult for someone here, but anyway, it's that will presumably have ripple effects on the child that's experiencing it, right? Like it may not, they may reject it in a certain way and be strong, but it's not, we're not like gonna do it. I mean, of course, for the puppy's sake, we're not gonna do it. But you see, like, but that's like what I mean by damage to like the psyche. Whenever there, or if someone was raised in the like 1800 in the South in America, and there was this terrible slavery, just horrific, right? People's kids are being literally sold out from under them, and just people treated subhumanly, et cetera, et cetera. If a person was presented with the idea that this is normal, this is how it should be, then that's going to cause psychic damage in all sorts of ways, in the sense that in order to incorporate that into your worldview, that that's an okay way to treat other people, other stuff has got to give, right? Like there's going to be ripple effects there. You can't, right? Like you can't just take on one horrific idea of how to treat your fellow man and have that be isolated typically, right? That's going to impact other thoughts and decisions about what's okay to deal with people, even if it's like not someone who's a slave, right? But just all kinds of things. Like, someone might be thinking whether to steal or whether to beat their friend up because they're pissed off at them, and if it's already normal to beat other people, right? Like it just, right? These things have a big impact. So now my dilemma, or our dilemma, to the extent that a lot of people care as well about this, that are listening, is of course that not of course, but it's that there isn't like an immediate benefit. Like if someone's having a survival issue in life, right, or any kind of issue where they're kind of hectically trying to deal with their own problems, which I by far understand and have been through, right? Then there's not like an immediate benefit to exploring ideas that will then lead to other frames and ideas and clear things up. For example, talking about words and how to understand them or use them, right? And how they work. If you do that, your functional brilliance will go way up, skyrocket, right? Other people really won't be in the same category or league, or you'll be qualitatively different than them in your ability to think. And there's all kinds of practical benefits to that, but they might not be immediate, right? Like there's going to be kind of steps and layers. And so the ideas necessary to help to start to dissolve some or many, of the horrific kind of cultural ideas that are causing great damage, both immediately and, as I say, kind of like psychically in a ripple effect in so many ways. I mean, you have people publicly praising the burning and destruction of other people's like livelihoods and stores and whatever. I mean, that's bizarre, right? Like to me, I mean, when I say the way I was raised, I mean even the culture I was, it's just kind of a bit surprising. Like we wouldn't necessarily have thought that we'd get to that point. Or in my generation, so to speak, it was right at that point. It was like I was growing up, coming of age in the 80s. That means that Martin Luther King had given his speech about the content of someone's character versus the color of their skin. What about 16, 17, 18 years ago, right? Well, that's in 1980, of course. Then in the middle of the 80s, it was more. But in that time frame, it had really resonated to the culture. There was just a lot of improvement and a feeling of improvement and a feeling of that really catching on, even though there's plenty of various forms of racism still, maybe especially when it came to, like, I think at the dating level, right? Like when it came to that sort of thing and marriage, I think that there was a lot of that having to be worked through, and then that got worked through over the course of maybe about another 20 years. I would say this is just me spouting off for a second, but like around, I mean, just giving opinion in a sense for my best call, but maybe in the 2000s, at some point, then it became almost a plus, I think, like kind of in the culture at large in general, to have an interracial marriage, whereas in the 80s it might have been looked at as a bit of a risk or would carry some negatives with it, and so forth. But that was changing, right? But it was still on kind of a good upward trend. But that's reversed itself now, where it's literally can be, I mean, someone can be horribly criticized and destroyed or whatever for now agreeing with Martin Luther King's statement about judging someone, being kind of sort of colorblind in the sense of judging someone on the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. Right now, it's there's an idea that if you do that, that's horrible, and instead you need to judge people on the color of their skin. It's very critically important. We need to treat people extremely differently depending on what race they seem to be, and it's just kind of a little odd, right? That might on the surface seem to make sense in certain cases, but then again, the kind of psychic damage from readopting the idea that we need to treat people very differently based on the color of their skin, or it's once again perfectly fine to call entire races or groups evil, or even calling for them to be killed and so forth. In the case now, it's white, especially white men, right? It's perfectly fine, but that it's a little bit weird because that actually, as a subgroup of white men, generally, or pretty much always Jewish men are a subgroup of white men, and so it's back to calling for Jewish people, evil and to be killed as a subgroup, of white people. So it's odd, and that's going to cause damage. However, the immediate benefit to people, of dealing with things that can deal with that is not always apparent, right, to people. But in aggregate and as a ripple effect, it will live in a much better world if we can dissolve a number of bad ideas that are out there. So there's that on the whole. But now on kind of a more personal, or not personal to me, but on a kind of more individual level, let's take a look at some examples here. And as I take a look at these examples, so to summarize, if we work on what we see with, then that is going to lead to reliable success that's actually oddly easy as well. But it takes a paradigm shift to feel progress from doing that. And sorry, just to go back to the slide while I wrap up a couple things. If we had, I started to say this a couple times, if we had a dirty window, but we didn't realize it was there and that we were using it to look through, then we can ask the question, well, how would we then spot it? And it has to do with another paradigm shift, related paradigm shift, about how we treat anomalies. And this is illustrated so well in a book series. I really recommend this. I really recommend that you go look for Sophie Hannah's, Hannah, Poirot books, and just read one and see. I think the first one's called The Monogram Murders. I believe that I'm going from memory. I would think that's correct, but you can find them. It would probably be under Christie in the if you're in real life in Barnes and Noble. Of course, some people go online these days, or maybe everyone, most people. I like having like a book in my hand to read rather than a computer. But it would be under Agatha Christie alphabetically, probably in like Barnes and Noble. But then you'll have Sylvia Hanny. Now her books are great too. It just she particularly emphasizes and is clear in her books about this thing where with anomalies, and of course this shows up in various other murder type of people like Sherlock Holmes and there's a zillion other types of angles on this on various characters, right? But it's particularly explicit in the Sophie Hannah's Hercule Poirot books, where he focuses on questions and regarding kind of these small anomalies. But so the paradigm shift I'm referring to about anomalies is that the way our mind normally works, it first really tries hard to marginalize and delete things that don't fit into its story of reality, right? And there really have to be a lot of pretty strong anomalies and maybe some environmental situation that kind of causes someone to be sort of humble or confused or something that sort of opens them up a bit, right? Could be in some cases a critical mass of anomalies. It's hard to track exactly what it is, but we don't want to have to wait for that type of circumstance in our lives. And then the other problem is that when someone has that, they don't get all the way to the bottom of their thinking. They'll just have that about a certain area of life, right? And so even whatever the circumstances are that kind of cause that, for someone to start to notice, wait a second, and break out of their worldview, right? Like the Walk Away series, like politically, right? That on YouTube, I think they somehow got removed from Facebook, which is odd because it's just testimonials of people leaving one political party that they were raised in, because they've been previously taught that the other side was just evil, and then over time they're like, oh, wait a second. So our mind normally wants to marginalize and delete, anomalies, things that don't fit, and that's not how we spot these invisible, like dirty windows, right, in our mind, so to speak, or our lives. So what we want to ask ourselves is, what would be a way of thinking and acting that would help us spot these dirty windows, right? Again, because you can't see them directly. So you have to, at least you have to be like asking and trying to find them before you might find them. But I've talked before about like kind of the Perseus thing about like you kind of see in reverse, right? Or you see like with a mirror, like the opposite or something. But in general, it's anomalies. And again, as I get to examples, maybe I'll be able to explain that better. And I just want to cover the invisible and external. That's actually the type of thing where, like me in my career, which of course is my own like business, like as an entrepreneur as opposed to a job, and it's always had to do with info marketing, basically packaging like a coaching course that would help people, in selling it. And here's what, if you're doing that, what you want to sell are invisible but external things like these end up being like tools or lenses, but basically what Greg Morrison comes up with, what Eric Brief's come up with funnels, right? Talking to people on the phone, and then he's developed into also just a funnel approach, email and other types of contact that all integrate. But and I looked for years to try to find someone who's particularly great at spotting, right? This comes across as very clever, and because it is, right, very talented and clever. People that develop tools, in the case of sales, like scripts and other things relating to scripts and how to look at stuff. But these very clever frames that other people aren't spotting, including me, right, for how to get clients, right? Even people were getting clients, but Eric Brief is just so much better at showing people how to do it, right, than what a normal person would figure out on their own, or even people that are purporting to teach that stuff. Or me, I made a couple of videos giving some good understanding of, and some kind of shifts, about that would help people get clients. And it helped people, but I'm nothing compared to Eric, right? In terms of just sheer talent and being into it and figuring it out, right? And so forth. He just both so talented and curious, had good methods for figuring it out, and spent years doing it. And same thing with Greg with SEO, right? So those are examples of things that are invisible, but once you discover them, they feel and they are very valuable to people. There are these sort of two different types of value. There's this kind of because the perceived value of these external but previously invisible until someone figures them out and points them out. And I have a bunch of this in law of implication too, right? There's things that I show people that are kind of easy to see, and they feel like clever, and people didn't see them before, and then I show them and they're like, wow, that's awesome, right? And I'm really aware of how awesome that feels and how useful that is, right? It's just that there's two categories of these invisible frames, and the thing is we need both, and they each have their place, but we just want to get a bunch of correct frames, right? Like the internal, what I'm calling internal, or the ones you kind of identify with, that are kind of, see, there's things that I'll point out they kind of remain invisible even like after, or sort of invisible or hard to see, or at least there's also like kind of an emotional defense against working on them, right? Like they can feel wrong, these kind of internal invisible things. They're hard to see because there isn't something to see them with until we develop that first. And if I start by developing the most foundational frames, the irony there is that there's no immediate use for those except for to see another problem, right? Does that make any sense? So I need to get to some examples, but just to try to explain the concept, in either case, whatever I do, you need kind of both. I need to explain the concept and give examples, and I have to start with one of those, right? And until I do both, then it's going to be a little bit of vagueness or a lot. But anyhow, okay, anyway, just to quickly say the general concept. In order to see internal and visible frames, assumptions that are core, deep, or any other things you identify with, a problem in what career someone's going after, they've invested in, or what angle in business, something that someone's really invested in, they feel like that, I really want to do this type of business, right? But maybe they shouldn't, maybe that's not a good idea, but they really feel like they identify with that, right? That's them. They've decided they want to do that. So that's hard, right? To shift for someone. They feel defensive to some degree about it. They might even work with me or whoever's helping them, like where they might not be fully defensive, right? There's a difference between being like totally closed off and having some amount of resistance, right? There's always going to be some amount of resistance in a certain sense, right? From something where we identify with it. In essence, we have to almost like chip away at the identification itself and be able to step away from it, right? Now, what helps us do that, right? That helps to show why explaining who we are as a being who's conscious and that has some amount of power or free will and such. That fundamental foundational frame allows us to step away from most anything else we might identify with. So, which then has massive consequences, right? So it allows us to make the paradigm shift of stepping away from things we identify with in individual cases of things we identify with, even just to examine them. There might be things you identify with that are just fine, that are even correct, right? But you still need to examine them because you don't know that they're correct until and unless you examine them, right? It's like doing door-to-door sales. just to picture it. Like you can't just knock on the doors that are where people are home and are going to buy something, right? You just have to knock on doors. If you're not willing to knock on doors, you can't do door-to-door sales. And same thing, if you're not willing to examine ideas, that are core to you, then you're not going to spot the wrong ones, right? There's going to be plenty that are right, but then there's going to be plenty that are wrong. So in order to see, in order to be able to step away from, stop identifying with, and look at various core beliefs, we would first need to have the correct idea of our identity, ourselves as a being. When I first talk about ourselves as a being, if someone has something they need to urgently deal with, or some goal that they're trying to work on, they might feel like, well, why do I like, that's a little bit interesting, David, but you didn't really get to anything that I felt like was relevant to me, because you were talking about like naive realism, perception. You're starting to talk about like the world is made of reason, or the external world or something. And well, I don't know, where to go with that, right? But if someone doesn't have that, they can't see things that are very deep and core, and that can really be messing with them, right? An example of another thing or example of something that people have that I've mentioned is, or I mentioned constantly, is I even have this on the slide with business here. If I come down here, I wrote, I wanted to underline this actually. So I discovered this a while ago. I talked about this several years before I did OMG. I was talking at a kind of a small conference or whatever, and I even mentioned this then, prior to something called Stompernet that I worked on. That's where I kind of started to learn how to do like internet, business and launches. But I was aware of this, and it helped me so often and so constantly. And I was pretty much the only one that of people I looked at that could keep this consistent, or at least almost like very highly consistent relative to other people, just because I was aware of it, not because I'm more moral or fundamentally better, right? But if you have a distinction that's clear in your mind, and if culturally or just basic to how minds work, the opposite is how people are going to be by default, then they're just going to keep on making the mistake. And so people would make this mistake constantly. It didn't make me feel superior or anything. I just knew it was a better mistake not to make, right? It's like if they can't add and I can, it's not that I'm better, except that I know how to add and they don't, right? It doesn't make me a better person or morally superior, but it means that when adding is relevant, then I'm going to basically have better results, right? And if it kind of keeps adding up and adding up and adding up, you might have radically better results. So, and it's reasonably likely that you're running into this still, to some degree, right? It's such a powerful and pervasive thing that in people's minds, and so it's going to kind of keep seeping back into our mind in a sense. But when you're trying to make money, then you're trying to make a profit, right? You want to have more money at the end of the day, right? Than you're spending, and you also want that profit to get into your personal account, not like theoretical profit, like people have all kinds of ways of like bending the definition of profit, because what is going to keep happening is some angle on trying to prove that you're awesome, right? And Suleiman gave the great example of in a recent webinar where he discovered that on some level he was trying to compete with his sister, right? Or kind of prove that like he could do as well or better. Of course, presumably she wouldn't be doing internet business, right? She might just have a career, and the parents might be like, why can't you be like Sally, right? Or whoever, or just they might not say that directly, but they might be, hey, Sally, is doing this, and it's like, oh, she got a new car, or she's got a raise, or it's nice I can visit Sally on the weekends because she doesn't have to work on the weekends, but you have to because you're doing your business. It just seems to come up. Right? There's all kinds of ways that parents or other people can kind of pressure, right, the psyche. And so, but that would be an example of what I mean about proving yourself as awesome, right? If you're kind of subconsciously trying to impress your parents, and that's powerful, right? We all have that to a certain degree, right? Or at least we all have that pressure, right? Maybe we've dissolved it, right? But at least if we dissolved it, we had to dissolve something, right? But something like that is going on. Obviously, we could be married to someone and they could be saying little things too, right? Again, they could be saying, so and so's husband doesn't have to work on weekends, and that's it. Or they just might say like, and that could put pressure on you to feel like you shouldn't have to work on weekends, right? And then people can just be talking, or there can be people on stage and they can be talking about how much they make in a month, or how much they made with this project, or car they bought, or this or that, right? And it's not that it's wrong or right to be talking about those things. We've done plenty of people talking about how they've succeeded with OMG, because then we can learn from things. But what can seep into our mind for sure is, well, I want to prove that I can do that too. But you're not in business to prove that you can do something. You're in business to get money into your personal bank account. I would basically explicitly, and I would say this to people, and I would tell Mike and so forth. I'm like, my business, in the sense of the way that I measure my business success, is how much money is like in my personal bank. Not even how much money I, in theory or whatever, put into my personal bank account. Not even the profit of my business, but how much I even kept, right? I still had at the end of the year, right? So part of because again, I wasn't even in life to be doing business, or I wasn't in the money game. I was in the money game not by choice, but by necessity, right? And so it wasn't even about doing business, right? Like even thinking of it as doing business is still like kind of starts to meander over this proving yourself awesome as a goal. I wasn't trying to succeed at business or excel in business or prove I could do business or be a businessman, right? I just wanted a certain amount of money, either monthly or overall, in my personal bank account. And I basically wanted to be able to not have to, deal with money. And so that was more of a holistic approach of spending, right? And then how do you deal, and then what you're trying to do in succeeding at something is then you start to look at, well, or if you're smart, you ask questions about what else could be realistically, in the environment that would help, right? So if I want to spend less money, now there's a limit to spending less money, right? Then I need to kind of understand what that means, right? There's a certain somewhat minimal level of comfort, but not below that. Whatever minimal is, but minimal in the sense that I'm comfortable as is reasonably necessary, right? Or at least, but if I'm uncomfortable doing business to a certain degree, then I need to weigh that against how comfortable I need to be, and with the money that I'm spending, right? And there's kind of a bit of a place where there's a sweet spot within that you estimate. But then whoever's like really in my psychic space, right? Like, for example, people living with you, obviously like your spouse is going to be majorly in your psychic space in the sense of their comments, the things that they kind of light up about, right? Just your spouse getting kind of a shining, happy look in their eyes and really feeling like communicating that they think you did something awesome. That's a powerful, positive thing, right? And so the more that's aligned with, ending the year with a bunch of extra money in your personal account while spending money in a kind of sustainable way, right? Like if you're eating beans and rice and living in a shack, but you really don't want to be doing that long term, then maybe you don't need to be eating beans and rice and living in a shack. Maybe you can eat decently and live in a decent place that's more sustainable. Certainly you can have something that's less expensive before you have the money to get something more expensive, right? But again, you're just kind of looking to, when you keep your eye and you're able to see, right? Because you kind of clean some windows and that you've spotted at least, then you can kind of see to judge, like judging accurately sometimes just happens simply and automatically when you have worked on what you can see with, right? So I use that general paradigm of I want to break free financially, and to think I use that itself to kind of as something to see with, and then that leads to questions of what environmental things can I think of that would be conducive to that, right? And so the culture in your home would be something, right? You can influence that to a decent degree, depending on your relationship and the personality, right, of the person that your significant other or whoever else is in your home. When it comes to parents, in my case, it's fairly hard to change the culture if I'm living in my parents' house or if they're too much in my space, right? Then I don't really have a lot of impact on how they think and their little things that they say. And I have perfectly fine parents, by the way. I don't mean to be implying that they're fundamentally, flawed in a way that's abnormal like that. They're perfectly kind of, normal to even on the good side, of stuff. But anyhow, but I had to mostly remove myself from communicating too much with them and then being ready when I was communicating with them to not get drawn in, right? Because my mom certainly will, say things that push in a certain direction, right? And like I said, like, oh, so and so has done such and such, right? That sort of stuff. And again, that itself can be a bit of an invisible thing. And you can also, and this all relates to little pressures on proving that you're awesome, right? Or proving that you're good enough. It might not be awesome, it might be good enough, right? People have and it relates to, there's different areas of life where in some areas of life, you probably have this kind of subconscious sense that you want to be awesome in that way. Maybe it's morally, maybe it's a specific subset of morality that you look at, or how you dress, or how people like you, whatever it might be. And then there's other places in life where you just want to be good enough, but it's important to be good enough and not, terrible. And in other people's eyes, in your own eyes, et cetera, right? There's your own sense of wanting to feel like you're good enough or awesome, depending. In various ways that you can look for, and then there's the ones in terms of peer group or family or your significant other or wherever else. Having this distinction of keeping your eye on profit, or even more specific than that, right? When it comes to your personal bank account or whatever, growing or however it is. And it could be a sustainable kind of monthly thing, but where it's kind of sustainable, where what's important to do to sustain the income. It's a little bit of a parallel to a relationship, right? Relationships have to be upkept. They're kind of like the equivalent of like monthly income, right? But what you're looking for with something that's ongoing, like a relationship, as opposed to, I also have the idea where you can make a certain amount of money and then just put some of it into annuities or whatever else you think is wise or that works for you. I'm not into giving advice on like what amounts to speculation, right? But I like annuities because they kind of essentially remove the speculation, but you can't really remove all the speculation. But anyhow, there's the idea of just getting a certain amount of money once and for all. That is fairly realistic. You can't fully control that. People can steal from you. The world could end, so to speak. The whole world financial situation, system could collapse. But I don't really see a lot of profit in really worrying about that stuff. But then there's the idea of monthly income, which is valid, but it's valid in the sense that it's similar to a relationship where monthly income is valid if what's important to do and to not do in order to make that income is something that is cool with you, that you can deal with, right? Same thing when you're in a relationship with somebody, then the things that are important for the other party that you're in a relationship with, that you both do, and the things that's important to them that you don't do. Then then if you can handle those things reasonably, and you got to be realistic about that stuff and try to get it right. Because if you make a long-term commitment that involves a maintenance that you're overly optimistic about maintaining, then you can be kind of screwed, right? I mean, eventually you probably work your way out of it somehow, but it can be not a great thing to have to deal with. So anyway, profit, and again, you can tailor it to yourself. Again, that could be kind of ongoing where the maintenance is reasonable for you. I wasn't really, I maybe have now. I've said this before, I've said it, but ironically, maybe I have found a way to for now, at least make profit in a way that's reasonably sustainable, right? One of my issues with making money ongoing is that I'm a little bit too aware of how you're basically a criminal, and I've just been I've run into it in actual real life, not where I've been actually put in jail or anything, but where just being treated like a criminal when you're audited, or I just cannot. With the state that I live in, unfortunately, Tennessee, there's positives to it in terms of the government, but the corporate tax law is just impossible to decipher. It's not built for internet business, and when your business has nothing to do with Tennessee, and there's a tax, and it's just so in my personal situation, it's just kind of I was gonna say there's a tax you can't even really figure out. I just get conflicting advice on paying it or not, and so it just kind of messes with me, right, in a lot of different ways. So it's just kind of based on a personal situation, right? Someone else that might live in Florida or Wyoming or wherever might not have nearly that same kind of problem. But then for me, moving there is just a whole bunch of other issues. I don't really want to leave my house. I like the house plan, like both my parents and both my grandparents did, where you kind of live in a house for decades and then keep storing stuff in the attic or somewhere, and then your kids, when you die, have to deal with that. I like that method. So again, just kind of deal with stuff that's tailored for yourself. But boy, is that I talk about this all the time, because the difference in actually being able to keep your eye on this versus getting into all the things that people do, I just I think it's easily like a 10x difference in terms of the money at the end of the year, your time investment, the things that you don't do because you feel like that's not something I want to do, or and all that stuff. The subliminal being scared to do certain things because it might show you that you're unskilled at something, but that you feel like you don't want to confront that, right? Like you don't want to go through that period where you're kind of bumbling around, right? We'll all do that to some degree, but then there's places where we really don't want to do it. I feel that, but that might be the place where you feel like you don't want to do it might be a place where you need to do it, in order to make money. And so really thinking about this and trying to keep focused on this, on the profit as your goal of some sort, and really watching out for the other things that people try to do in business. And you can spot all over the place when people are talking about what they've done in business in a way that is not really specifically geared towards profit, in their personal bank account at the end of the day. Not that if you do have that, you should run around bragging about it or not. But you can just notice the ways that people kind of imply that there are these other markers of success, right, in business. Now, there can be semi-soft locks, like things that you accomplish on the way to getting profit that are very relevant to accomplish, and you can be very happy that you accomplished those intermediate things. So I'm not saying that you can't be happy about building a website prior to making profit, or whatever, right? Learning a thing or learning a tool or whatever, right? Or that if you get a client and you're spending most of the money that the client's paying you, reinvesting into doing a great job with them because it's early on and you're trying to figure things out and make sure you get it right, and so forth. That's perfect. That can all be reasonable. I'm not saying you have to beeline straight to this, but you want to have this as your beacon, and be aware that there's this fake beacon that's going to keep popping up about proving that you're awesome, or at least not too unawesome. Oh, the one other quick manifestation of this that comes up a lot is when people have this intuitive idea of how long something should take. Right, I've touched on this recently in previous webinars, but just to bring it up in this context, if you're let's say it's a particular day and you got a new software program, and within a certain amount of time, we can all imagine ourselves feeling like, damn it, this is taking too long. Why is this taking so long to kind of figure out how to use this software? I don't know if I can make it work. And if you have your windows clean, then there are times when you're seeing kind of in a reasonably accurate way how well something's working, or how good a certain path is, or a particular software tool in this case, and you accurately see that it's not a great way to go. However, when your window's not clean, so to speak, then that can be confused with an arbitrary amount of time that it's supposed to take you to learn something or get a software working, or or whatever, accomplish any particular task, whether or not it's software. And so when you spot yourself feeling like this is taking too long, or any manifestation of that, either beating yourself up about that, or feeling angry at the people that made some other party because it's taking too long, then step back and think whether that's actually sensible or not. Again, if there's times when it's going to be a good judgment call to go look for a different path towards something, right? When you're trying a certain path or tool or software or type of venture or whatever, strategy, whatever, sub goal. But just make sure you're looking, you're doing it in a way that you're kind of reasonably looking at the situation, and not just comparing it. Your mind's not just comparing it to kind of an arbitrary sense of how long something's supposed to take. Something I've talked about, I don't think I've really mentioned it specifically in this series. It came up again in just a little, just a personal anecdote about an acquaintance who is applying for college and really wants to get into a certain type of college. It's another of a million examples of always watch out for, in general, for when your plan is for plan A to work. Right? It's a very bad plan if you have one plan and it needs to work, right? A plan should basically always have the structure of, I will try this path, and if that, and under these following, it could be general, you don't have to get into a lot of detail, but under the following circumstances, I'll start to look for another path, right? Either in sometimes you'll try something and it clearly won't work. Like you'll knock on someone's door, you'll call someone on the phone and they'll say no, or they won't answer, right? Then you're like, all right, I'll try another, right? Other times you're not sure whether the path you're on is gonna work, right? In the case of you're trying to make a certain software work, you're trying to rank a site in a certain way, or use some service, and you can't tell for sure whether it's happening or not, right? So, or you're in a relationship and you're not sure whether to stay in it or not, business, personal type relationship, whatever. But in general, your plan needs to have the structure of, I'm going to try this path, this plan A, and the general rule on switching to plan B is that you're eyeballing the difference, like you're kind of looking at the field, and it's clear that plan B or path B makes more sense. If it's unclear, stick with plan A, right? If it's unclear, if you're in a relationship and it's unclear whether getting out of it is a better idea than sticking with it, then stick with it. And set it up for success. Because what's the overall thing that we're discussing here? Oh, I'm already at the hour mark in the webinar. But the overall thing that we're discussing here is that you want to work on, you want to try to succeed or pursue success via developing better things to see with, or being better able to see what you can see with, right? And the way to see what to see with is to be able to have a perspective or a place to stand that's very deep or even literally rock solid. And then you can see all this stuff, metaphorically speaking, above it. Unless you get underneath things, you can't see, right? To see, you have to have some way of literally stepping back, or literally / metaphorically actually stepping back from whatever it is you're trying to see, or getting underneath. That's why me talking about really foundational things about reality and fundamental things about thinking, fundamental things about morality when it comes to property rights and so forth, is very relevant, because if we skip over to relationship stuff, relationships have just a beyond massive impact on our lives and kind of on every level, right? Our sense of well-being, our practical sense of having other people to team up with in all sorts of ways. Other people have all kinds of various talents that we can do a sort of trade, right, in their business and just personal stuff, right? In a personal and a marriage relationship, there's various things that people either have a talent for and or they don't really mind doing, especially in the context of that it helps the team, like the two-person or family team. Then they're glad to do it, versus someone else is really relieved not to have to deal with that sort of thing. So relationships can just do so much for us, right? Obviously, but a lot. And so when it comes to relationships, morality, not even so much in the sense of acting moral, like not cheating or something, but in the sense of all the judging and this person should do that, or I'm going to be upset if they don't drive me here, I'm going to feel like they don't love me, and right, people have all these things. A man should do this, a woman should do that. If they don't do this, then they don't really care, right? Just a non-stop, massive, never-ending list of judgments. And I really have made a marriage where that is hardly at all going on, if very minimal to zero. And it's below a threshold where it's an issue, in essence, right? Like, we're just super happy every day. We treat each other very nicely. We're not nagging and judging each other and just feeling these little dings that are building up in our mind of they should have done this, they should have done that. This little resentment just keeps building up, right? And so morality is so important because it is so impactful, because people have this, like, if the little, I don't have this like graphically, but if their little circle is what really should be done kind of morally, and then people have this huge circle of stuff that they think that people should do for them or should do or they should do and all that, and it's huge. And if you can just cut that out and pare it down and let the other stuff be bonus and nice and opportunity, that right there will have this just radical impact on your ability to have relationships and the quality of them and your quality of life and how calm you are. And because you're going to do the same exact thing to yourself, like your peace of mind is like your relationship with yourself, right? The three really practical overall categories that the law of implication deals with, at least as my version of it, so to speak, is relationships with others, peace of mind, which is like relationship with yourself, and then just like money, right? And so really, if you deal with those three things, you're in such good shape, right? And the tools can be used for various other things, right? But just in terms of the examples I use where I personally focus, right? Then like kind of the subframes that are more surface and more applicable and what I'm kind of interested in are going to be in those categories, right? And that I'll mainly talk about. So that's what I mean by if you're learning it from me, right? If someone, as other people master the fundamentals of method and thinking and the nature of perception and existence and things like that, and then they apply it to other areas like health, then excellent. I'm glad to have that. But I'm not going to spend long. I'm going to wrap up this monologue part here. But when it comes to these invisible frames, right, understanding who you are, understanding the basic way that existence works allows you to then see, to stand in a place, so to speak, where you can see morality. Also, as you understand that your mind is not conscious, your brain is not conscious, you are, and you start to tease apart the difference, and then you tease apart how your brain needs to twist things to kind of remember them and encode them and stuff. And so it twists the idea of good, which is an aspect of consciousness. It's a quality of consciousness, of your conscious experience, good. It twists it into that which furthers or is perceived or calculated or associated with furthering goals, right? And it'll associate like people with oh, this person's good, right? And that's like they're associating a person with what's associated with furthering their own goals, right? Which might just mean that the person has a similar worldview or similar politics, right? But that kind of provides a backdrop that they feel like being around that person kind of generally furthers their goals, or provides a framework for furthering their goals because they agree on cultural things. These deeper frames allow us to see morality more accurately, where we understand that our mind is going to twist good into that meaning of furthering goals and also that which is associated with furthering goals, right? In terms of people and beliefs and worldviews and so forth. So then we can, we're standing in a place where we have the ability, we still have to do it and think it through, but we're now theoretically differently able to see morality in terms of, and we can eliminate a massive amount of judging other people. But also realize when people really are doing something that's very harmful, because the trouble with harmful things is they're actually harmful, right? Like when I talk about taxation or other things in government, like with the FDA using violence, right, to prevent us from having a vaccine a year earlier, that has real harm. Like someone's really, having property taken from them, right? It's not like, oh, you should go to dinner with us on Thanksgiving, or you should drive me here if you love me, right? Like and if something isn't really an idea that's going to reliably cause harm, right? And when you undermine property rights, then you're causing harm by extension, right? Because if people are consistent with violating property rights, then the result is horrific. So some things really are harmful, right? And we can understand that those ideas are harmful. A person is not their ideas. So a person isn't bad, but their ideas, they might have individual ideas that are bad. And some are like really harmful. And if we don't recognize them as such, then how are we going to get rid of them, right? But again, the person's not the bad, right? They're just associated, like it feels like they are, but it's the ideas. But like if we're dating someone and then we see them enjoying torturing puppies, right? It's not that I have a thing for torturing puppies. I just, instead of bringing up rape and stuff, nonstop, I'll just talk about that. Then I think a lot of us, maybe virtually everyone, would break up with a person, right? So if we think about that consistently, then if someone else is doing something politically, like in the political realm, or supporting something that's the exact equivalent of torturing puppy, because why? We're not a puppy, so we don't think they're going to torture us as like in a one-to-one correspondence between, okay, I don't want to date this person, like if someone's torturing a puppy, we're not in immediate danger of being tortured if all they do is torture puppies. But our reasoning is that if they're going to torture puppies on a regular basis, then that's going to lead, that means that's going to show up in other areas that really will be a problem, right? And so, so I think you really have to be careful with getting in close relationships with someone whose political views involve violence and a massive violation of property rights, as if it's nothing. Because how is that not going to show up in other places? And I just mean that as practical advice, right? It's not like a political, I just think it's going to show up in the same way that the torturing puppies is going to show up other places. All right. Okay, well that starts to give some examples, and hopefully I covered enough of the invisible but external that you can sort of recognize that if you're going to, do a coaching program or if you're going to try to draw someone into your ideas, then you just kind of want to start with these kind of clever things that people are not identified with. Like people love having these sort of paradigm shifts that they don't identify with, right? Like, oh, that's a great tool. I never thought of that. Or that's a great strategy. I didn't think of that, right? If someone can see something that you show them, whether it's a strategy or whether it's a tool or an online tool or whatever, a technique or something to say to somebody else to get a result, and feel like, oh, that's awesome, that means they don't identify, right, with someone that already should be doing that, right, or with an opposite idea that, that conflicts with it they identify with. And that's the sort of thing you want to like sell or provide to people as your sales funnel, or just on a social level, the kind of thing that if you want to come across as clever, then you kind of, show people that without making it too obvious that you're patting yourself on the back, or trying to show off by doing. All right. I will wrap things up because I always have to just basically stop talking at some point. There's always more to say. I want to have Mike Broadwell on soon. I'll take a quick look at some comments, but just to kind of look over. Something to see better with metaphor. I had cataract. Yeah, cataracts are a great example because you generally won't realize you have cataracts, right? And then there's anomalies maybe at some point, like, oh, I catch stuff in sometimes there's miscommunication. This can come up with Mike Long and myself regarding I meant to ask him to do a certain thing in business and he misinterpreted, right, or something like that. Not he misinterpreted. I'm sorry, it's not his fault, right? There was a misinterpretation in between what I said and what he said. It didn't get communicated the way I intended. The fault could easily be, it doesn't matter. Could be wherever. But there's times when there's little anomalies in something he'll say about something he's in the middle of doing or whatever. And one of us will pursue that anomaly and we'll realize, oh crap, we really had a miscommunication there. We thought we were saying one thing, it was something else, right? It was whenever that happens, it would have been very easy to ignore that anomaly. So there's a certain mental habit of paying attention to certain types of anomalies, or anomalies, I don't know, in general, or that are related, could be related to something important, there's times in life when it'll be pretty obvious if an anomaly is in an area that isn't important, right? But as we start to ask deeper questions about frames that are deeper, then we can have a feeling that something's important, like, wait a second, what does it mean when I refer to that tree, right? That doesn't seem important to people, but if you're asking the right questions, then it can feel important, and it could be an important anomaly when you start to notice contradictions in what the word refers to and so forth. Okay. Fletch says, I recall having a conversation with you, David, about someone's favorite books they told me about and how that was a telling feature of the way they looked at things, what they noticed and connected with they're trying to do with their life. This sort of thing is quite similar to what you discussed about the torturing puppies. Yeah, right, totally, exactly. And it would be nice if we lived in a society where there were different worldviews, but none of them, none of them were particularly toxic, like horribly toxic, right? There's just times and place in history, probably a lot of times and place in history, but like in the Roman times of the Colosseum, right? If lots of people were cheering for someone to like get killed if they lost a fight or something like that, right? Or of course in like the 1800s in the South in America, and just lots of times and places, obviously Nazi Germany, etc., right? My wife grew up next to her grandmother. Her grandmother lived near, within walking distance of her. Her grandmother, when she was 4 or 5, her parents were taken by government workers working for Stalin, and they were taken to be worked to death, and she never saw them again. They went to some place in Siberia, probably died within a few years in horrible conditions, treated subhumanly, and just died trying to build probably like the Trans-Siberia, some sort of thing or whatever, some road or whatever. But because they were like intelligentsia of some sort or whatever, or Stalin, he just did this to literally millions of people. I think he was responsible for deaths of like 50 million people or so in his own country, between Ukrainian farmers displaced and all kinds of starvation and stuff and that type of thing. So there was a culture there were people, and they were just like police, right? I mean, they were just doing what police do, doing the bidding of the authorities, right, and so forth. And they did that, and they just probably went home to their own families, right? And And but they like dragged these, her grandparents' parents away, right? And just did that. Like there's just, it's kind of the norm in the world is that there are these like people really aren't good or evil. They're in a certain sense. They're, what I mean is in a kind of a simple but practical sense, they're extremely context dependent. And in the wrong context, they can really act evil, right? Again, even just supporting the existence of the FDA like it's okay to violently prevent people from someone who makes a vaccine from providing it to people. That's horrific, right? I had a friend, a close friend growing up, and his wife, who I knew growing up too, they both went to my high school. I mean, she worked for the FDA. I mean, I wouldn't be married to someone that worked for the FDA, right? To me, that's like torturing puppies. It's just so evil, it's incomprehensible, right? It also, you have to believe in expanding the federal government past the Constitution. So you have to fully and utterly believe that the Constitution is 100% worthless in terms of, like you just have to believe in infinite tyranny in order to work for the FDA, right? Since it's unconstitutional, it's expanding outside the boundaries of the Constitution, which means you have no boundaries on anything, right? And then there's no amount of tyranny that you won't tolerate and approve of, basically, except if you're just being arbitrary. So it's just this beyond evil organization. Its mere existence too is so weird because it's outside of the Constitution. The people, anyone that supports it, is an enemy of the Constitution, which we're supposed to be defended against by anyone that takes the oath in the military. So every single military member, past and present, has sworn an oath, a clear oath, to militarily defend us against the people, the FDA, and yet none of them are upholding that. It's all just strange. So we live in this weird world that's when you look just under the surface, there's just so much that's dictated by violence, and in a way that's extreme, right? That's really like in when I say extreme, it's on the level that of things that we are horrified by, and yet it's the same level. Like we're horrified presumably by slavery, right, in the 1700s, 1800s in America. It should just, I'm sure, right, just all of us are just feel like, wow, that's horrible. But what we have today is literally on par with it, and I'm okay saying that, right? And on so many levels, right? So just crazy. I myself, when I my teens and at some point, I don't know when it changed, when I realized maybe sometime in my 20s, I would feel like pride about how the US developed nuclear weapons and used them to win and defeat the Japanese and, and just kind of win World War II in a certain way, right? Or win it a second time after Germany was defeated. I literally, I felt like that was cool. And that's horrifying. I mean, how sick is that? I got like a good feeling. I didn't think it all the way through. That's how people arrive at these things. But in little babies being burned alive, they were fully innocent, right? And in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, these are just little children, and they were burned alive, and while their parents were like holding them in some cases, and they had to watch their parents get burned alive. And I felt a feeling of like pride, like, yeah, we won, right? And so, but at some point, that's an example of an anomaly. Like if you feel a good feeling at babies being burned alive that are obviously innocent, there's no real such thing as like a non-innocent baby, right? When you're talking about burning them alive, then that's an anomaly big enough that there might be other ripple effects, right? Anyway, so it just like we all need to confront this in ourselves, and and then and so forth. Yeah, 100 million. Mike says Mike's a kind of an expert on Russian history. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's get Mike Broadwell on. Do you want to go on audio, Mike? I have to find you and unmute you. Obviously, by default, you're muted. Let's see here. Attendees, Mike Broadwell. Now, this can be interesting because starting out in practice, I disagree with Mike Broadwell's position, but not in a way where I'm threatened by it in the least. Of course, I love finding out that I'm wrong or figuring it out. So I don't know where this will go. I'm not in this at all, of course, proven wrong. I'd much rather he be right? It's much nicer for me. And then it might not end up being about right or wrong. It might just be about um, identifying just pieces of things that where he can enlighten us and enlighten me, and where I can point out, wait a second, maybe you need to take this into account, or what about this, and where we just kind of do that, right? So we'll see. Okay, Mike, are you able to talk?
Yeah, can you hear me now? Okay.
I can hear you well.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I appreciate the chance to come on, and
Yeah. And I'd
let me.
love for you to start in a sense of just kind of talk about your thoughts about whatever it is, but obviously related to vaccination, COVID, and so forth.
Okay, well, let me give a bit of context. For the last
Sure.
decade or more, I've been working in holistic health. It's been my primary thing, and in particular, the type thing I've been working with, we work along what's called the terrain theory, or the biological terrain approach to health. And that's one of the things that the law of implication has really appealed to me, because when you talk about dealing with context, it fits so perfectly with health, and that
Mm-hmm.
most health conditions are complex issues. And instead of trying to shoot for the answer, which is really more what conventional medicine does, is to show progress by hiding symptoms, it's actually to work on the context of health until the problem kind of clears itself. And this is a whole school of thought known as biological medicine. I think Paracelsus is one of the founders. There
And
was a
I agree that's absolutely a law of implication principle of
yeah.
working on, yeah, intervening in context until it fills itself in and the problem solves itself. Yeah. By the way, let me just say something for everyone, not about this, but I mean about this meta idea. Um, but never be confused about the idea. I'm always fine with directly trying to solve any issue, achieve any goal. Like I'll often, as my first try or first thing I do, is just go with the most direct, obvious, normal, common solution, if that makes any sense. Like in the context of health, for example, and I'm not an expert, but I'm just saying, uh, I'm perfectly fine with trying the most kind of normal, common treatment. I'm perfectly fine with hearing what a doctor would do to treat something, or trying it as long as it, won't be a massive risk necessarily, or whatever. But anyway, just when we talk about solving, I'm not talking to Mike Broadwell here, Mike, I'm just saying, and I'm not in any way correcting what you're saying. I'm just kind of interjecting something I wanted to mention in general that everyone's clear on, is that when I do talk about context or overall how to solve a problem, or we talk about deep frames and so forth, none of that precludes directly trying to achieve something, or making that your plan A. It's just that, um, we also, lots of things we need, lots of things can't be answered or solved unless we understand how to keep on layering, going wider in context, deeper in context until something's solved. But perfectly reasonable to solve anything that can be solved instantly, and or whatever. Okay, go for it.
Well, and it also relates. It's an ideal approach to really understanding nature and all the complexity of life, is because you mentioned also GMOs, which kind of go hand in hand along a similar vein. But if you look at the real problem in the
Genetically
modern
modified
world,
organisms.
yeah, genetically modified foods. The problem is the human body is way more complex, and one of the big failings in our Western society is that we have tend to ignore what we don't understand, as it can't be important if we don't understand it. And this is a thing
I think
called
that's
scientism.
universal to all
Yeah,
people's minds as they marginalize and delete, regardless of culture, probably.
exactly. So I've got a friend here who's a farmer, for instance, and he's studied for many years how to grow grasses and the whole ecology of nature. And so one of the problems with our modern agriculture, when we just want to, kill bugs with pesticides and then we fertilize, is we actually destroy the whole economy of nature. There's a very complex symbiotic relationship from everything from funguses to bacteria to all the things in the soil. And actually, even insects are designed to sense the frequency of weaker plants. They're actually meant to take out the weak plants. The strong, healthy plants have too much sugar for the insect to handle. So they're actually
Oh,
designed
interesting.
in
I
a
never knew
healthy ecology. So
that.
what we've done in our modern sense of trying to up yields and make money on things is to poison and totally disrupt this cycle of nature, which has led to this declining ability to get nutrients in the food. Even the water, the way
Maybe
that
more
we,
allergies.
what's that? I'm sorry.
Maybe more allergies.
Yeah, more allergies. Even the way we use water is very destructive. Water has incredible properties. So just overall, using the law of implication method of starting with what we know and not what we don't know, really is the way to approach a very complex ecology, something like the human body, the nature, all these things. And it goes back to the ancient world, which ancient teachings were about retroduction, or eliminating what's not true till you get to what's true. That actually goes back, as I've been learning, to very, very ancient times. And so that's kind of the context of where I start. And then if you look at even the whole germ theory, which Pasteur is the father of in the West, he was opposed by a guy named Beauchamp, who promoted the terrain theory. And Pasteur is actually the guy that came up with the whole viral theory of disease. The word virus means poison in Latin. It didn't mean organism. And so this Pasteur thing, the whole idea of pasteurizing milk, again, killing off, supposed pathogens, has led to this kind of sterilized, everything's an enemy, everything's a terrorist, we have to be in fear of all these viruses and all these things that are going to get us. But there's another side to it, which is the toxicity of the environment that we've greatly increased with industrial, use of oil, use of all these sprays, pesticides. And there's really been an ongoing debate since the beginning of vaccines that have they really been the root of, say, ending polio? Because there's a lot of research that shows that polio was peaked because of usage of DDT. And when DDT started to be backed off of, that kind of correlated with the same timing of the polio vaccine. And even the developer, Salk, and the other guy that developed a separate vaccine sued each other and blamed each other for causing all these deaths. So the world of vaccines has not been an unbridled success. And in fact, it's pretty scary. And one of the indicators of that is that vaccine manufacturers are no longer liable for injuries. There's a separate government-funded pool of money for vaccine injuries called the vaccine VAERS, where you actually go to this separate court, which is funded from taxpayer money if you have a vaccine injury. So there's a lot of criminality on the behalf of the vaccine manufacturers, a lot of lawsuits on other drugs and other things. So, but what my question is when we use law of implication, because to me this is really a fundamental property rights issue. That if I can be forced to have something injected in my body that is hotly debated. Now it's interesting, the same group that is squashing, property rights, free speech and all that are the exact same groups that are promoting vaccines. If you look at Biden's whole campaign was, we're going to vaccinate everybody, make everybody wear masks, make all this stuff. If you go to a college campus, they're like Soviet Union, even Swanee, which I don't know if you've been down to Swanee, not too far from where you live. That little campus out in the woods, which is a gorgeous little campus, it was like huge signs about you must wear a mask, even walking in the woods, and just the propaganda of colleges. So the same people that we would say are horrible in terms of free market and in free speech are actually, they're squelching alternative doctors. I know a lot of the top alternative doctors like Mercola. There's a Dr. Christian Northrup who I haven't met, but she has been on Oprah 8 or 9 times. I mean, she's a big name doctor who was lauded by the establishment for years. She has come out against the vaccines and how dangerous they are, and she's been completely marginalized. And so the same marginalization we're seeing across the board with political stuff and freedom of speech is happening exactly to anybody opposing this vaccine agenda. So there's a lot
Let me ask you something.
Yeah.
Let me, Mike. let me ask you something. So I agree with you on that for sure. Um, of course, like the censorship is insane, right? It's like also when you compare apples to apples, there's all kinds of hoaxes that are, kind of obvious. Recently in the news there was the thing about Russia putting bounties on American soldiers in Afghanistan, which was false, but it was a big campaign issue. Democrats telling it was true, and there was no warning label on Facebook, about those things, right? It's only stuff like vaccines or election stuff. So it's ridiculous. Um, and the politicalization of things in America is of course a real problem. Uh, but I don't, so when it comes specifically to, like, I'm with you on everything you're saying, but when it comes to a couple of things, so viruses existing in the first place, um, I don't see how we get to saying that viruses don't exist as like a DNA sequence with a coding. I mean, they're so the amount of that type of mistake. I don't like. There's tons of terrible mistakes that live in the world, right? Like ideas, but I don't see how viruses wouldn't exist and how that can possibly measure up. It's like saying Paris doesn't exist. Like the same people that have all kinds of horrible political views, like Hitler might have said that Paris existed, right? I'm sure he believed that Paris existed since he, invaded France. But that doesn't mean that Paris doesn't exist because, Hitler thought that it did. I'm sure Zuckerberg believes that Paris exists too, but it doesn't mean that Paris doesn't exist. When it comes to the existence of viruses, I just don't see how that could be a hoax. And then, and I'll stop in a second to have you respond. And then COVID specifically, I don't see how COVID itself wouldn't exist and actually be the thing making people sick with COVID in nearly every case or whatever. Um, and then you also have like Semmelweis and the washing of hands and germ theory, and kids used to die in childbirth like nuts. And then doctors started washing their hands, and that made a huge difference, right? As I understand it, like there's something about that coherent story that I don't see. Um, like it made sense not for them to do it, but in the sense of understanding how people think, the medical establishment resisted Semmelweis and the hand washing and so forth, as the story goes, for a long time. They resisted Pasteur. I mean, Pasteur had to disprove spontaneous generation with his little flasks, and his ingenious experiments. Um, you have penicillin, which, to imagine that that hasn't made a huge difference and really helped and saved a lot of lives. I like sometimes killing germs and things, or or bacteria or viruses, seems like it's relevant, or the idea that vaccines in general don't. I guess I'm bringing up too many layers here. I need to let you respond. But where do we go with trying to, like, with viruses not existing and COVID itself being basically all false or not even really existing, and it being what, toxicity? I can't follow that. Like that just seems like where, and I don't see where the motivation would be, or seeing what happened in Italy early on where they denied it. Like everyone's first response to COVID, so to speak, was to say it's probably not a big deal, right? From Pelosi and the Democrats to Trump. Um, he took it seriously in one sense of stopping some travel. But I mean, everyone's first response was, it's not here yet. We don't need to panic. It's not a big deal, which is understandable, right? Same thing in Italy. But then people really were just dying by the droves in Italy, and husband and wives would just die together, in their house alone. Was that all toxicity all of a sudden happening? Or, like, anyway, go ahead.
Um, well, yeah, I'm sorry. I wasn't sure if you were finished or not, or if I lost your
Yeah, I
connection.
understand.
So I'm not saying that there aren't viruses per se. What I'm saying is, and certainly bacteria. I mean, bacteria. And see, this is another scientific problem: is that when we take cells out of a body and put them in a petri dish, one, we're shifting from an anaerobic to an aerobic environment, or vice versa. But we're taking them out of the whole context that they actually work in. So yeah, a body fluid which works fine inside your body, if we cut you and it spills out and then somebody eats it or it gets in there, that can become toxic because that's going to shift states. And yeah, that can become poison to somebody and cause an issue. But viruses, and this goes back to the AIDS. If you go back to HIV virus, they've never made a causative link between AIDS and HIV. AIDS was always considered you had all these existing diseases and you were HIV positive. And they used this PCR test, which the founder of said is not valid to use for human diagnosis. But if you had, say, what is it called, sarcosis, sarcoma or whatever, and you didn't have the HIV virus, then you were not considered an AIDS patient. But again, the
But how about
correlation
COVID?
with, well, COVID is
Talk
the
about
same thing.
COVID.
They've never isolated the COVID virus. What they've done is computer model it. And if you actually look at what they call virus isolation, it's almost beyond absurd. They put things in a blender with monkey kidney cells and antibiotics, and then they mix all this other stuff in, and then they claim, well, okay, these cells died, so there has to be a virus here. But they're not isolating it. We would consider isolation to be purification, that I can singly isolate this virus. And what they've done,
Didn't they sequence the COVID virus like a year ago, more than a year and 3 months ago?
well, they've been, coronaviruses have been around forever. There's a million, different variations of coronaviruses.
So there
And
are coronaviruses that exist.
well, I'm not saying viruses don't exist. I'm saying is I don't know that they're causative for what we think they are. They're basically little chunks of DNA or RNA. There's no life in them. They don't have any.
Yeah, I get that they're not life. They're a protective protein layer around DNA or RNA. But I mean, remember, something happened in Italy, and it's not the kind of, like when 9/11 happened. 9/11, people could theoretically debate on certain causes or issues, right? I have traditional views on 9/11, but that it happened, that the Twin Towers were blown up, like there's certain things that just don't, again, like there's not really any anomalies. It's just it to question them gets to the point where, in my terminology, it'd be unreasonable, right? Like again, if I just said that Paris didn't exist and I said, well, Paris doesn't exist because like there was a city one time and people thought it existed, but it didn't exist, and so Paris doesn't, like, like, or these other people that say Paris existed, they're wrong about this, that, or the other thing. Well, Paris just exists, right? Like, and there's at some point where we can't like live consistently with the idea that it doesn't. In Italy, people were dying, like the idea that they weren't dying of COVID in Italy, it just gets a little bit like all of a sudden these people got this disease, like it's so consistent as a reality. And then, like, just to give a simple, like, here's my worldview about coronavirus, and try to tell me where I'm going wrong. So A, viruses exist. B, vaccines can help against them, right? And there's just I realize that anyway. So I take that as true, and again, I get that we could debate that, but I mean, in the sense that someone could debate anything, and I don't dismiss it. If someone wants to bring something up, it's perfectly reasonable to do so. But the story is so coherent, and there's no like when Fauci wants us to still wear masks after being vaccinated, you can track the mistake, like why that starts to get insane, and you can track the kind of thirst for not even just power, but this kind of weird situation in America where it's just everything's political in the sense that if one side thinks one thing, the other side thinks another, and how the left loves to have these kind of weird moral issues, that these crisis type of panic things and these virtue signaling of wearing a mask and so forth. So the position that after you're vaccinated, you don't wear a mask. You don't need to, and that culturally it shouldn't be that. That seems so reasonable to me. And everyone, when you look at how that would function in our society, that works out great. Now, like it could be a return to normalcy. Before any government intervention or shutdowns or whatever, the economy was running into major issues that were going to almost certainly get worse because COVID, what was happening in Italy, and then there's outbreaks in New York City, and it was getting more and more, and people weren't going to restaurants, and so forth. Like sectors were shutting down, or starting to shut down a little bit before even the 15 days, to stop the spread. And then vaccines, I don't know, like I mean, some things like you're not prepared to kind of discuss the opposite, but the great thing about businesses is they have their brand to protect. When you have a big business that's making a vaccine, yeah, they have profit motive, yeah, there's flaws there, but same thing, like I don't like Xfinity or whatever, the cable company, but they do in fact reliably give me internet, right? Like a pharmaceutical company that's making a vaccine for COVID has such an incentive to get it reasonably right. And what'll happen is there's enough people that are willing to take a risk for the sake of others. Not others that won't get sick, but so many people's lives were destroyed economically by COVID, and so many people's mentally, the isolation, the ripple effect of the economy, having their kids around all the time, whatever. It's so devastating psychologically, or people not doing medical appointments that otherwise that could be relevant, right? I get that modern medicine has various flaws and maybe major ones, but at the same time, if people aren't going to hospitals for procedures they need, that has issues too, because there's various things that the modern medicine or Western medicine does handle. Okay, I actually agree that there's plenty of things they might not handle well. But anyway, but the ripple effect of COVID was so terrible that there's a bunch of people in the population, including myself in this case, right? There's things that I'm not that into doing, but I would go get the vaccine right off the bat in January of 2020 when it was made. I would have tried it, just like there's people that volunteered for the trials, right? And maybe you try it on rats for a week and just make sure they don't die instantly, right? But yeah, it's a foreign substance into the body, just like when I eat a hamburger, right? It's a foreign substance into the body. And I don't know what's in. I don't know the long-term effects of exercise, and we can be careful and not take any risks of hard work or exercise. But some amount of people would have gotten it. Then we'd see if they lived through it. And even depending on the effectiveness of it, there's just apparently enough technology these days that they can make pretty safe vaccines like right off the bat. I mean, it just has to not kill you, right, or not cause like some terrible, neurological, thing. I don't see how it's that hard to make stuff that don't kill people. I mean, restaurants do it all the time, right? They make food and it doesn't kill you when you eat it, even though it's a foreign substance. We don't know what they put in it. They're a profit-oriented corporation, and yet we eat their food, and it may have various amount of health, but it doesn't just kill us instantly. And I don't know. I just think it's reasonably likely that the vaccine would have worked, over a year ago, and I think that actual real life has proven it to be correct. I think that if someone's vaccinated, I know I'm just asserting something for a second, but the position that I have is, if you're vaccinated, there's a good chance that greatly defends you against the disease, and then I also think that the real effects of COVID, between people dying, but then all the ripple effects of everything shutting down or nearly shutting down and having to wear the masks and all that stuff is so powerful that the cost, is not that powerful. And one last thing, the whole thing about they're forcing me to be injected, I'm fine with not forcing people to get a vaccine. However, it's not as cut and dried as it might seem. So first of all, if someone gets hit by a car, they're unconscious, and the only thing that's going to save them is to inject them with adrenaline, then without their permission, it's reasonable, even very possibly the obvious right decision, to inject them with, let's say, adrenaline or whatever. Maybe it's an allergic reaction that's knocked them unconscious, they're about to die. You inject a foreign substance in their body. We don't know the long-term effects of that particular substance, even if we if it's been used for 100 years, we still don't know what'll happen after 200 years or what'll happen with that particular person who's complex, but we still inject them with something to help save them. If someone's going to get hit by a car, you can tackle them physically, which otherwise would be a property rights violation. But there's circumstances where it's not the same type of violation. What if there was a zombie apocalypse caused by a virus and people were turning into zombies, but they could be turned back by injecting something into them? I would be fine with injecting people with something that unzombified them and turned them back into a normal person. I'd be against their permission. I'd be injecting them with a foreign substance, even if it was fairly experimental. If they were a brain-eating zombie, then the risk reward on something experimental, just the eyeballing it, the balance is just not even close. So for me, taking that into account, to me, like eyeballing it, it's not even close. You get the vaccine and you live a normal life. Like people that are saying wear a mask at that point, they're insane. That's terrible. It's horrific. It's tyrannical. Wearing a mask prior to that, reasonable. Maybe wrong, maybe dumb, lots of arguments on both sides, but reasonable. Wearing it after vaccine, not, you know. Anyway, that was kind of a long spiel. I don't want to use the fact that I'm leading the webinar to talk over you or anything like that. So I'm finished for now. I want to hear whatever you want to say.
Well, for one is these are not really vaccines in the classic sense of what's called it. These are technically are not vaccines. These are mRNA genetically modifying things. So what they're doing is they're making your cell act as if it's working against these symptoms. And they're not even designed to stop COVID. They're designed to minimize the symptoms or lower the symptoms. But they're not traditional vaccines put a small amount of the virus or whatever supposedly they're protecting against to cause your body's natural immune system to build up antibodies to it. That's not how these work. And some of these, like the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson, have been halted. And certainly in Europe, a lot of the countries have actually stopped the AstraZeneca, and the Johnson & Johnson's been stopped in several states. In fact, my dad was going to go, and we kind of scared him. He said we scared him, but he called to cancel his appointment, and they told him, well, we had to cancel anyway because this Johnson & Johnson is causing stroke-related issues in certain people. And so, the vaccine injury report, this is by far the highest percentage of vaccine deaths ever in history. Since December, the reported vaccine injury deaths with the CDC is over 2,500. Studies have shown that system underreports from 30 to 100 times the actual amount because people don't always correlate, and then there's a lot of pressure to not correlate. And then in the same way that even what's her name, Bricks or whatever the lady was, and Fauci, she admitted that if you get hit by a bus and you've got COVID, we're going to put you down as a COVID death.
Yeah, no, that so I
this
know.
Was going on. What's that?
But the thing with I'm aware of you get in a car accident, you have COVID, they might put them down as COVID, but there's still a lot of people dying of actual COVID. I mean, like even if those numbers are inflated a bit. So one thing I'm not prepared to discuss one way or the other. You can just, you say it and it can cause questions and we can look into it. Like the amount of deaths caused by the vaccine. I mean, I'm shocked if it's anywhere near that high, and particularly 30 to 100 times that high. I mean, you're coming from a particular worldview where you're particularly suspicious of these things. I remember reading as a young boy, so I'm biased kind of in the other direction, where reading about Pasteur as a young boy, and I found him pretty cool and fascinating. Obviously, there could be plenty of propaganda and stories that you get to kids. I get that, but it just seems like basically the hand, the increase in like sanitation, like with the hand washing and so forth, that doctors do and such, that it's just been the main, way that people live longer, and you avoid infant deaths. Vaccines just seem to be something that, just in my simple experience, just seem to generally work and not kill that many people. Are the authorities incentivized to not report, and the media incentivized to not report on deaths that could be related to the vaccine? Absolutely, of course, I agree with that. You'd expect them to not hear news reports, particularly about it in a certain sense. Although there's plenty of alternative media sources that would be fascinated by that stuff and want to talk about it, as I'm sure you're aware of and look at. it's tough with a vaccine, because if you give someone a vaccine and they die a week later, if you give it to 100 million people, then some number of those people are going to die, regardless, right? I'm sure, you're aware of that, of course. I mean, not that you would take them into account, but a lot of this comes down to how dangerous is the vaccine really? Is it causing thousands or dozens or any number of deaths? And these are facts that I'm not, I have nothing to say about them, in either way. It's one of them or the other is true. To me, in terms of like being an early adopter with a vaccine, in this case, the amount of suffering and death and destruction from economic to mental and so forth is so large with COVID that I'd be willing to risk to have a minimal but existent risk to my life to to take a vaccine based on the mass, like the cost benefit just seems incredibly out of proportion. um Something was killing all those people in those nursing homes. Remember in Seattle, you had a ton of people in one nursing home die. Like, what is that if it's not a virus that's real, and fairly, uncommon, right? Like, it all is just so, whatever. Um,
Well, we don't know for sure because there could be a toxic release. I mean, one doctor that I've met who's really he's got 3 different MD certifications, and so he's a very, very smart guy. He pointed out that the symptoms of people turning blue and not being able to uptake oxygen is a sign of the same thing as cyanide poisoning. He said this is exactly what happens in cyanide poisoning, and we have well-established protocols for addressing this. And he also pointed out that many of the hot spots like New York City and Italy, these areas are places that are using a lot of the green energy, the fuel oils that they make from recycled waste and from fracking oil, which are very high in cyanide. And these refineries and these city buses in New York run off these kind of fuels that are actually high in cyanide. So we are getting into very toxic situations in these
yeah,
cities.
but
And
isn't that just going on in the background as a base rate? Like, how does the general existence of cyanide somewhere explain, like COVID? We've all lived in this world for a while. COVID is like a fairly unique and major thing. That's, again, it's like cyanide poisoning. How is that gonna? I just don't see how on a wide scale that sort of thing gets confused with COVID. It just, the incentives aren't there. Like Julie was talking about how I agree, like without government, then the more effective and safe vaccines would just like, the better movies, they get rated higher, people talk about it, they can get online, right? Like, and again, companies, because of their brand, which really matters, they want to get things right. So it would get sorted out rapidly and relatively effectively, given that government is not composed of smart angels, right? It's composed of basically the opposite, right? A lot of the assumptions that people have in the background about government is, oh, if the government doesn't do it, then what? But they're assuming these all wise angels. So given the government makes plenty of mistakes, yeah, just having, anyway, what the hell was I saying? But like, so there's all kinds of places where you expect biases and errors and outright bad things and evil, but COVID actually being cyanide poisoning, it just doesn't, it's so far away from what makes sense, and the incentives aren't there. How again, like
well,
all of a sudden in Italy, all at once, they're getting poisoned by cyanide and it becomes COVID, they say, and how does that add up? It's too.
well, it's not so much that it's just exactly what we're seeing though is there is increasing toxicity everywhere. The 5G rollout, there's a lot of questions at the frequencies that 5G works at, and electromagnetic frequency. I used to work in technology, and I remember going. I was at a company meeting one time, a sales meeting from all over the country, and I heard these guys talking in the bathroom, and they were talking about how somebody that worked in a certain radar lab had died of kidney cancer. And he says, yeah, we all have to get checked all the time because these certain frequencies are causing kidney cancer. Well, the 5G is operating at a frequency that's in the level of oxygen uptake and all too. And So there's a lot of, and there's been no safety testing on 5G, even though there are several professors and researchers in Europe and Canada and other places that have said this thing is very dangerous. And so what we're seeing is that these corporations are really running roughshod, and they own the media too. And the
Yeah,
media
totally.
lies so much about everything that we can't really know. Yeah, this Geert van der Bosch also talks about how dangerous the vaccine rollout has been. So there's a lot of stuff going on, and then you've got the fact of the thing that Bill Gates put together in October of 2019, which is this pandemic. This global, this, what do you call it? A dry run. What if the world gets hit with a coronavirus? And they had all these people. You got the World Economic Forum that was putting out information about how we need to restructure the world economy because we're going to have a pandemic, and a lot of things were put into place before this hit that showed this was kind of planned on a larger scale from a lot of the big corporate entities and the governments around the world, which we're seeing really are just,
I mean, but
one.
do you see Bill Gates? Like, I'm not a fan of Bill Gates or his wife. They have their motivations. They're authoritarian, elitist, and et cetera. But do you see them as like a Bond villain who's literally plays a secret part in spreading a deadly virus to prove themselves right? I mean, I don't. That would, to me, that's again, it's a bridge too far in terms of like acting on or affecting my behavior. I mean, it's a theoretical possibility, but I don't know.
No, I don't see him at all as that. In fact, I see people like Gates and
I think
Zuckerberg
they
as
take
really
advantage. They certainly take advantage of, obviously politicians take advantage of COVID to advance agendas that have nothing to do with COVID. Like that's by far clear, and I said, and not that it's dead obvious, so I'm not saying it was smart of me, but when Biden got elected, he was obviously going to pass a massive amount of spending that were just to interest groups and line the pockets of rich, powerful people, and say it was for COVID. Like that's dead obvious. That just fits with everything we know about the world. It's the most predictable thing in the universe, and that's exactly what he did, right? Just massive sums of money to rich, politically connected allies, right? That's what it's about, right? There's no platform for the Democrats. It's just that and useful idiots. And he just did it in plain view. I mean, anyone could see that that's exactly what he did. Um, so that's a sort of thing I expect. But I think even with Biden, as much as evil as he is, and no one's suggesting this, but I'm just saying, if someone said what we can do is release a virus that'll kill half the population and it'll make you and your son richer, I think he actually wouldn't do that because it's not. They still need some way to feel like they're virtuous. They're so evil, but they still find ways to think they're virtuous. I don't think they could do it if they're intentionally killing people, or even with the FDA, they don't see themselves as killing hundreds of thousands of people, even though they did, you know.
No, and I don't
But
think that this is necessarily an intentional release of anything, and I don't really see. There's so much. I mean, there's documentaries out there about how Fauci and the NIH have been funding this gain of function research. Are you familiar with all
yeah,
that?
yeah,
So they
right,
purposely
right,
try to
yeah,
make
yeah, yeah.
viruses more deadly in order to patent them and use them as military weapons, and also to
Yeah,
create
that's
this
fine.
need for more. So that's
Yeah,
very
I mean, I
questionable.
think it's fairly likely or very likely that this was engineered half on purpose, half by accident. You know what I mean? Like, in essence, right? Like that it was in a lab and they were messing around where they shouldn't, for the wrong reasons. They didn't intentionally release on the population, probably, although you never know with the Chinese government. I don't think the individual doctors did necessarily, but at some point when the leader of China, I think he could you know do a lot. You didn't have no idea what he might do. Um, but um, yeah, anyway. Okay, well, raises some good questions. I'm glad that when you talk about LOI principles, you're talking about things right, like context, and so forth. I think we don't know, what I do want to hear with these people that say that the vaccine is dangerous is a really hard-nosed cost benefit. Same thing from Fauci, and these mask crazies. I don't mean it was crazy to wear a mask before, but after a vaccine, And by the way, the reason I say after a vaccine, maybe I haven't made this clear. The thing is, at this point right now, whatever vaccine we're getting is the best we're going to get. And it's better to, when I say that practically speaking, given government stopping things and messing around with things and everything, and various people's motives, the only way to get back to normal is a vaccine. Because people aren't just going to get back to normal without one. And so it's better to just behave as when you don't know. Remember, I say in a gray area, you pick what's most useful. So what I'm going to do is, and I'm about to get my second shot in a few days. I already got the first one. I'll get that second shot, and I'm done wearing a mask unless I absolutely am forced to for somewhere. I'll wear a mask if I'm forced to, the same way that if someone mugs me in the street, I'll hand over my wallet, right? If I'm not able to fight back, and there's a bunch of guys with guns. So I'll get the vaccine. I'll behave normally at that point. I forgot what I was saying about Fauci or these people with they'll take advantage of whatever crisis, whatever. But yeah, and then we get back to normal. I don't see why someone would pick something other than I don't care about the forced vaccination, but voluntary vaccination and get back to normal. Because at the point where there's voluntary vaccination, then we can all stop wearing masks. We can all behave normally. If someone doesn't want to get vaccinated, then they don't get vaccinated. They're fine. They can behave normally anyway, right? And then if they do want to get vaccinated, then they're either safe or there's nothing we can do, and we have to stop. Because at some point we have to stop shutting things down, stop having the economy destroyed, and move along, or stop having these poor people in Starbucks wear a damn mask for 8 hours. I can't imagine living like that. I can't do it. Maybe it's more difficult for me with the way that I breathe and so forth. And but we got to get back to normal.
It violates OSHA, and OSHA surprisingly is just dropped. Under OSHA, you have to prove medical health and be trained to wear that PPE type gear.
Oh my God, they're violating the Constitution in blatant, obvious ways, right and left. And people, there's not enough pushback, and there's not, again, the military. I get it. It's tough, right? Ashley Bobbitt, when she was trying to uphold her oath, she just got shot, right? And then no one cares. It's just extraordinary. In the Capitol. But yeah, I mean, sorry. But yeah, anyway, like given the and when it comes to like the property rights violation of it, I don't see why we would fight. Why would we die on the hill of whether or not we're vaccinated? Like this libertarian idea of, oh my God, big brother, vaccinations, a vaccination list. So what? Like, my point is, if we lived in a world where other much more horrible things weren't going on, but why would we fight there? It's like, I'll tell my son, like, why are you fighting about this, right? Like there's places to fight. If we're gonna fight, taxation is infinitely worse than even forced vaccinations and a list of who's vaccinated. Who cares? This might sound shocking to some of you, but who cares if there's forced vaccinations? Who cares if there's a vaccination? I could easily see if I had a business of any private residence of saying, I don't want you coming in here if you haven't been vaccinated for some reason. That's a reasonable thing, right? If there's a zombie apocalypse, like you just take things, as I say, to an extreme sometimes, you just think, right? Like if there's a dangerous virus. Now, if I've been vaccinated, I might not care, right? I can see why that wouldn't care. But so that's where the weird issue is I don't see why it would need to be forced or a list. If people can get vaccinated, then if they're worried about it, they get vaccinated. If they're not worried about it, they don't, and that's that, right? Unless there was some third reason that I'm not taking into account. Like for example, if the vaccine was deadly to people 70 and over, and so they couldn't get vaccinated, so we had to really be careful about the spread, then that could be a different story, in some way. But anyway, I don't see why fight there. There's no, like this whole slippery slope, I say, don't worry about that. There's a real thing going on. Taxation isn't just taking your money. The government at any time can force you to give you and your wife, all your spending records, private, business, everything. Taxation is over 100% if they want it to be. They can deny all your expenses, tell you that you owe millions of dollars past what you even made. It's so horribly violating. It's so horrendous in so many ways that why wouldn't we focus on that? And Faith pointed out there's slavery, sex trafficking. Why die on the hill of a virus? And why have, half of the people on the right saying they don't want to get vaccinated. It's just again, why fight there? These are the same people that don't care much about taxation, or they're in favor of it. Most of the people, most Republicans and people on the right are in favor of taxation, right? All
Well,
Democrats and most Republicans.
well, see, the problem is that we don't really know what the numbers are. One, because they've openly fudged the numbers. We also don't get hammered every year how many people die from flu and pneumonia, which flu and pneumonia deaths have gone down to about nothing. And there are plenty of people out there that are actually showing the numbers and showing that this is no worse than, say, the flu season 3 or 4 years ago. So this has been a manufactured thing of hysteria from a lot of different points of view. So there's a lot more to it, and I don't trust the media at all. I mean, they literally make up so many
Well, that's
things.
good. Yeah.
Uh,
Well,
we
like I
can't.
said, though, you don't trust the media, but when they said 9/11 happened, it still happened. Like, but I'm not arguing with you. If you look at the facts and you look at what you're looking at and you have a different, I think, I don't think it's necessarily unreasonable what you're saying. I think my position is also reasonable. I think despite the fact that I don't trust the media, despite all the terrible incentives people might have, and so forth, the basic idea that there actually is a virus, that vaccination could help both psychologically and actually, right? I mean, if nothing happened, but people could just get back to their lives, and then whoever dies the virus. At this point, that's probably better, right? I mean, whether one way or the other. So even if it was totally, the funny thing is, even if it was completely fake, the vaccine, if people just generally believed in it, it would still at this point probably help. It's probably because nothing seems to matter in terms of the spread, right? Countries have all kinds of different policies, states have different policies. They say 3 feet does make a difference, and I believe it. 6 feet is just BS based on some guy's guess about some other disease in the 1800s. That's what Tucker said. Figure that might be true. So anyway, whatever. Just it's the same way with masks. I was in favor of generally whatever will get people back to some sense of normalcy, for the sake of people that this is devastating to. It's not devastating to me. I don't care, doesn't the staying inside and having businesses get destroyed, it's not personally impacting me. I still make plenty of money, have plenty of money, but so many people are getting so devastated by this COVID that's why I was in favor of just everyone wear a mask a year ago, and let's get back out, at least go in a restaurant, something. And now just get again, I'm not advocating for this. I'm just saying that this is where I eyeball is the most reasonable thing with everything taken into account, but without getting deep into all the anomalies, like, yeah, I mean, it just might be a huge opportunity. There might be massive, fallacies when it comes to viruses and vaccines and toxicity, and that we all just need to pay attention to those anomalies, like I was saying. I think it's obviously worth looking into in a sense, long term, But again, the funny thing about the vaccine, if it doesn't kill you, and even if it helps a little bit or not at all, same thing with masks. If it gets people back to normalcy, what I think is the most unreasonable and is objectively unreasonable is this stuff about staying away from normalcy after the vaccine, because at some point there's nothing more we can do or wait for. Because there's no way, every another several months or year that we act like we are now as a society in terms of just staying home a lot or having to wear a mask if we go out, which makes me want to stay home, is just so devastating to so many people.
But see, the other thing is we don't actually propagandize people with anything healthy, because it'd be much healthier, instead of wearing these masks, to quit drinking soft drinks. And one of the big problems, and one of the doctors pointed out, that if we just cut down on ACE2 inhibitors, which are widely,
or take vitamin D, right, or zinc,
yeah.
But those things, you have to also keep in mind, those things are not going to happen. So we can advocate for those things, but there's two separate things. You can fully advocate for stopping drinking soft drinks, 100%. But again, the vaccine is just a fully separate issue. And again, it's interesting to take into account my view of, even if it didn't work that well. And it's just, how does it not work? It's been tested on tens of thousands of people. I mean, again, there's a point in life where you can, investigate, and there might be something massive to find out about how it's all BS, you know. But um, it's at least if the people talking about how we don't know about the vaccine and who's died of it, at least if they were very clear and quantified about the cost of ignoring the vaccine or downplaying it or actively fighting against it, then that would be great. Like if someone was like, here's my issues with the vaccine, here's the cost of taking the vaccine, here's the cost of not, and really take into account, which also, you know, Fauci doesn't do and all that stuff, right? Like, and the wonderful thing is we got really lucky and had this unbelievably great president who did think about that stuff explicitly and thought about the vaccine. Like it was such a balanced approach from Trump. You're just like a normal, you know, like it just seems to me like, you know, when he really fought to get the vaccine made, I just think in real life, thank goodness we had a president who took the vaccine seriously and who took the cost of the shutdown seriously. Or DeSantis, same thing. He takes the vaccine seriously, but he takes the cost of the shutdowns and the policies, and not just the policies, but how people. And I think you just need to look at both in this case, because the cost of the existence and the fear of COVID. And I don't think it's a entirely fake fear, because again, Italy, like, you know, I'd have conversations with Mike and it'd be, you know, good conversations. Early on, we try to figure out COVID and what's going on, and it's so politicized in the US. But then I said, look, however much it's politicized in the US, look what happened in Italy. Was that in order to overthrow Trump or against Trump? No. What happened in Italy had nothing to do with the Democrats wanting to screw Trump. Do the Democrats want to screw Trump at every possibility, including making up the most ridiculous things? Yes. Right? But COVID, did they use COVID to, in all sorts of incredibly unethical ways? Yes. They literally blame Trump for nearly every COVID death, a lot of these leftists, which is just beyond extraordinary. The reason
COVID,
is like, yeah.
Yeah, I agree. But, you know, the countries aren't even what we think they are. These big corporations are running the world, in my view, and there's no real countries anymore. These are just figments that we still believe in, and they keep us
But how does
organized.
that address what happened in Italy? The
Well,
massive
we don't
death.
know that the numbers in Italy are any more accurate than the numbers here. I mean, there were certain
But
conditions.
how do you,
Italy,
in today's day and age, how do you have basically no important disease in Italy and have the news reports of tens of thousands of people dying in Italy when
well,
it's not happening at all? How do you
well, see,
fabricate that?
the numbers are not that high compared to some of the worst flu seasons in recent years. And actually, there's a lot of statistical analysis and people running numbers that just don't get any play. The media has been 100% COVID fear in the mainstream, and so people are being herded into this fearful response. And you know, the thing is, I don't think there should have ever been a shutdown. There was no constitutional basis for doing it, and it should have been voluntary if
Yeah,
people want to
I
shut
agree.
down.
I agree with that. Just, but even, I mean, look, it's so complex. I agree. You don't know what to do with COVID. There's just so many kind of reasonable different things. At least you just try to eliminate the unreasonable. And you know, and that's all I try to do. And you know, where I don't even, there's not like a specific thing where I try to convince you of one thing or I think you're wrong about this or that. But I kind of have to cut this short at this point. But I'm glad we got to discuss it. Hopefully the discussion itself was worth something, and you can continue, you know, obviously continue to kind of point out specifics or people, you know, like you've done posting in the group, so we can kind of look into, you know, various things. But you know, as I made obvious, I'm not kind of like like I'm kind of weirdly mainstream, you know, with various things, and I pick my battles, you know, and so forth. But at some point, you know, I don't know. But yeah, it's hard
No,
to
I
know. Maybe I'll
appreciate
have other thoughts.
I
Yeah,
appreciate the opportunity, because I think a lot of us would just tend to say, well, if David thinks this has got to be true, and because we do think, you know, and so I think in this
yeah.
case it's
Well, I
just
don't have on health. I am explicit. I don't think I'm right in general. I'm just, you know, I
right.
try to point out, you know, certain, you know, things.
Yeah. No, and I agree. And I think it's just really more of it. We're kind of forced to start in an arbitrary position on something like this and take it from there.
Yeah, and
But
that's why we don't want to, which you can't base your life or get all worked up over kind of like facts that get so confused and nebulous. And that's where, like you said, we have to try to identify little bits and pieces of what we know. But that's why I go back to Italy, because there's something large there. There's something big that happened. I go back to, I was going to say like Pelosi, I need to wrap this up, but like Pelosi in February was encouraging people, to get out and stay out and ignore the virus, and it was no big deal. So I agree that they changed their mind at some point because of the political. Obviously, everything's political in my opinion because of that. But maybe we can destroy Trump over this, But it's interesting that pretty much everyone's instinct with COVID was it's not going to be a big deal everywhere. Like no matter where you look, China, Italy, Democrats, Republicans, me, right? No one was going to because you had SARS years ago, and I hardly knew. Apparently, it was a big deal somewhere, but it's no big. We ignored it. There's no big. Didn't matter. It didn't somehow come to America in some weird way. So this idea that it was all fabricated, again, I think it was taken advantage of. But I don't know. Like it's just hard to imagine there wasn't some reality. That there isn't some reality underlying it, and the idea is that vaccines just don't work at all. I mean, because you really need to kind of go all in on both the fabrication theory and vaccines don't work theory in order to be against the vaccine, if you think about it. Because if they just work reasonably, vaccines, and if COVID generally exists and is relatively dangerous in the way that that it was, if there's again, you're either all in on it doesn't exist and/or vaccines are utterly worthless and utterly dangerous. But the minute, this is where I get my conclusion from, is to kind of wrap up, is the minute vaccines work decently, and the minute COVID is reasonably real, then it seems to me to only make sense to take the vaccine, to not have roadblocks in front of the vaccine, like I talked about with the FDA. Get the vaccine in people's hands who at least want it, and then people need to behave normally, because at that point, those are the correct ideas. Get the vaccine quickly, go back to normalcy, and again, that is consistent with the premise. So if the premise is true, the vaccines worked reasonably well at all, even a bit, and if COVID is reasonably real, then I think it necessarily follows that you go with the vaccine and then you get back to normalcy. You don't have government policies shutting anything down, no masks, etc. Same thing with masks before the vaccine. If vaccines work at all, if masks work at all decently, along with 3 feet or whatever, and that's all you got right then, if that's going to mitigate the horrifying effects in the economy and people's lives, then you do that. But then you stop it after the vaccine, just like you date when you're single and you stop dating when you're married, right? And so forth. So again, I would say that it's definite that my conclusion follows from the premise. If someone challenges the premise, I'm not equipped to have much to say except for to listen and to say, I'm glad you can present that alternative idea that maybe vaccines don't work. They're way more dangerous than we think. They hardly work in a way that matters. Or COVID is way less real and dangerous, and basically it's not dangerous in the sense that we say that flu and other things, it doesn't rise to the level of people panicking. But it's an interesting, the whole thing with COVID is an interesting thing, that what seems to be true is that right about 2 or 3 or 4 times worse than the flu, deadly than a bad flu, then you reach a critical point. And I think this makes sense psychologically. Now we could say, well, the media made it, but really the media who gets elected, it's all mirrors of each other, right? They all reflect and reach, it all reaches a critical point. Same with stock market. The prices of stocks in the stock market, there are several factors. A lot of those factors are psychological, but then they become they're real, right? And the psychology matters at some point. So at some point when the flu, something would be a bad flu, becomes 2, 3, 4, 5 times more deadly, then there's an interesting psychological impact. Apparently, I read that they could have vaccines ready for literally anything that's going to come about because there's hardly any that are reasonably tested and approved, and just takes a bit of money because there's not that many variants of even what could possibly exist, which also goes along with what I know about evolution and the limits of it, and so forth. So again, I'm kind of for that reason, as if vaccines work at all, then I don't see not being pro-vaccine. That's kind of a little bit. They just have to just really not work, and then therefore be the product of this incredible conspiracy of corporate greed and and so forth.
Well, I think the big picture is just that when you let a system that's as evil as we have on property rights violations and taxation grow to this degree, that it becomes such a monstrous thing that you can't really trust anything it does, and it's really poisoned the
Yeah, no,
well.
I agree that sucks. That's why it's so counterproductive that Facebook, is so. Of course, we don't want them to censor it all, but at the same time, they're so obviously insane and hypocritical with what they censor, right? You have these massive conspiracy theories that are very impactful that they don't censor at all. They're obviously false. And then, they randomly just censor the most reasonable things. I mean, there's a ton of extremely reasonable stuff that they and Amazon and all these places censor about vaccines, that needs to be out there. And as Tucker Carlson, who I think is on point with a lot of stuff these days, I don't, there's times when he's not, but I feel like, he's been pretty good perspective. But anyway, I don't know why I bring him into it, but anyway, there's just a lot of when you eliminate, what he says is, when you eliminate reasonable dissent, of course, it just makes people very suspicious. It's just very counterproductive and it's stupid, right? There's lots of very reasonable stuff from the point of view, like just silencing it all is just crazy when it comes to COVID and and stuff like that, and then the vaccine, and so. All right, I'm gonna have to cut this at this point. I'm gonna look to do some one-offs. I'm even fine with having Mike Broadwell on again, and even maybe somehow getting more into things in a certain sense of in some way, who knows. But then I'm gonna put together a particularly great series that I'll probably hype it up pretty decently too when it's all ready, and it's be free, the usual. Everything's gonna be not like a business thing now, but make it so it's particularly focused in the right way and really good for new people, because really all of us, what we need is something great for new people that's also comprehensive over the course of the series, right? Like I think at all catering to people that have heard things before, worrying about saying something I've said before, I have to drop all that completely. I have to have a series that's public and complete and interesting, like a good sales funnel in the sense that it kind of holds people's attention fairly decently, throughout. They see the benefits in various ways, while getting into all of it over time. I think is what we need. Ha ha, that's a great way to say how we hype it up. That's great. So I appreciate again the great attendance and over 50 people on live, the whole time, and just appreciate you guys a ton, and the participation, the support, and then the mission, of getting this out there to people. And appreciate Mike for coming on, and we had a great talk, I think, because the subtext is it also just shows how to talk, what to talk about, what to get wrapped up in, what not to get wrapped up in. And facts are great. It just takes time. It's not worth discussing facts on a webinar in a sense. It's more worth opening up and referencing them, and then people being able to look into things. And a lot of this stuff is going to take a ton to unravel. For whatever reason, I'm kind of currently my conclusions are I'm not against like GMOs. I'm kind of just kind of odd in my opinion. I'm kind of not odd, but I'm kind of mainstream with that stuff. Because there's certain premises like, hey, we don't know what the long-term effects of such and such are. Well, that's true. The trouble is that's true about basically everything. So at some point it's like with Facebook censorship, we have to apply that universally or not apply it. If if we're going to be suspicious of everything because we don't know the long-term effects, we have to be suspicious of everything. It's hard to live your life that way. At some point, you have to pick, where it's important to kind of investigate and fight and so forth. Okay, love it. Love it, guys. And I welcome. I mean, you posted a good amount of facts, but I welcome, additional facts and sources. Don't think that there's any issue with posting about this. And so great. Thanks, guys, and I will see you soon. Probably I'll do one in 2 weeks, but I'll update in a week or so with what's going to go on in the near future. But for sure, I'll be making that overall series, and I'm going to really. I think I'm ready to be kind of immersed and obsessed with making it good, as opposed to with this previous series, I was into it and wanted to do a good job and spent a lot of time preparing, but I wasn't fully obsessed, if that makes any sense. Thanks, Lawrence. I appreciate you greatly. Oh, you know what? I also really want, what I want to do for a little while? I want to have other people on. I want to have Megan. I'd like to have Lawrence. I'd like to hear from you, Lawrence, and whoever else. I don't know if we want to, if Suleiman would want to come on. And which Sophie Hannah book? Oh, the Poirot ones. I think the very first one. I think she's written 4 of them. I think Monogram Murders is the name of the first one. Yeah, so I might contact people as well and look to just talk about your experiences, interpretations of LOI, any questions or things that you've found impactful, anything you've discovered or whatever. And I'd love to have that. So maybe we'll look to do that while I'm working on getting the series prepared. Because I'm interested in kind of having a fairly large amount of preparation, even much more than I had for alchemy, where I still was working to do it in between, sessions. I'm going to see how much I can have all kind of ready in like outline form before I start launch into the series. I want to really do the best I can to make sure that it's going to be very good before I start. Calori, absolutely, I wanted a calori. Yeah, it's true. Great. Well, yeah, I didn't have alchemy like outlined out that specifically before I started. I was just ready to be very obsessed with it and focus on it constantly was the main thing with alchemy. And of course, I discovered a ton of stuff prior to doing it. All right, guys. So yeah, we'll almost certainly do something in 2 weeks, and almost certainly with where we have someone else live doing a lot of, even a good amount of the webinar. Okay, maybe we'll start with Megan, if you will. Maybe 2 weeks. Okay, I'd love to go with Lawrence then after that. But I'd love to have you on. I'd love to have you lead a webinar, but I think the ideal thing for in every way would be to have me on it live. But you can really take the lead with it, Megan, in a sense, and I could just be kind of on live with you, however. Or it wouldn't really be relevant who was leading and who wasn't, but just we'd be on. You could have anything you wanted prepared, but then I could be on, with you and ask some questions sometimes and so forth. I did that with sometimes with OMG topics, right? Remember during maybe dimensionality or something, every other week I had about 4 different people on. I think maybe Megan was one of those. But that was about SEO and business stuff. But anyway, okay, super, Suleiman, great. Yeah, so the general idea would be if someone was going to come on, you would have prepared a decent amount or some structure of what you want to talk about. And then I would be on there with you, and then we would go from there. Mohammadi, yeah, if he wants to come on. Yeah, I'll go for several weeks. I'd love to have a number of people on because I wanted to develop, heroes, so to speak. And I don't mean that I don't pronounce who a hero is and who isn't. I don't mean that I anoint you one. I just mean help people rise up. Just the same with OMG, right? In OMG, we didn't like dictate you're a superstar you aren't necessarily. I might say this person's a superstar, but not in contrast to somebody else. I won't even really say that in this because I'm not really more in marketing mode, but just have people on and it'll be great for several, spend a few months doing that and then get into the series. That'd be great. Yeah, exactly right. I think it'll be great, to start fresh. And particularly, I learned lessons from this series where I kind of had 1 foot in and 1 foot out of starting fresh, and kind of 1 foot in and 1 foot out of being kind of obsessed with it in my life. And I think I want to spend some amount of time when I'm doing the series I'll spend a few months where I'm really focused on it nonstop. I have my notebook every day, and so forth. It helps me with COVID winding down. Be great if Starbucks itself would just allow seating at this point. I don't get it at this point why people can't return more to normalcy with the vaccine. In Tennessee, anyone can get the vaccine already, literally. So whatever. And again, it's fine if someone doesn't want to get it, but then they can just not get it, and that's fine too, right? In either case, people should be able to chill out. Awesome. And what's heroic is just caring, about LOI. It's not like there's not like with money where it's like I'm making such and such a month. Shake out your mind sugar. Oh, that's great. Yeah, so Mike, maybe what we could do with you is just have you come on for one of these webinars as well. And I'll just spend as long as it takes to get people on, because I want to develop people. I want to have a thing for new people. That's critical, but I want to develop people. And if if I need to do it every week, it's because it'll take too long, in real time, to do it every other week. It's not a lot of difficulty for me if I'm having people on. And you don't have to go for an hour. You can go for half an hour, 20 minutes, whatever. But what I could do with you, Mike, just like with everyone, is you could have something prepared about LOI or something, and it could be related to what we talked about today, but kind of additional, or, talk about the shake out your mind sugar and that sort of thing. That's awesome, buddy. Anyone can drive. Anyone can drive in the dawn of Mike's. All right, super guys. You can also message me here in WeChat and give me a contact for being like a friend. I think that facilitates things. Awesome. Yeah, and of course there's Faith if you want to come on. All right, well, great. So I might have to do every week, starting in maybe 2 weeks. All right, guys, appreciate you immensely, and I'll talk to you all soon.